My name is Harper. I am 32 years old and I am a senior marketing director. I lost my entire career in a single afternoon, completely destroyed by a calculated lie I never saw coming. My own sister orchestrated my downfall, my parents chose her side, and all I could do was watch everything I had built burn to ash until the truth finally surfaced, and the fallout was absolute. It started on a crisp Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago. I walked into the sleek high-rise office of Zenith Media, feeling completely untouchable. I had just finalized the pitch for a $50 million national tech campaign. It was my absolute masterpiece. I spent 8 grueling months working late nights, sacrificing weekends, and missing family dinners to perfect every demographic analysis, every financial projection, and every creative angle. This campaign was my guaranteed ticket to a vice president title and the culmination of a decade of relentless ambition. I had started at this firm as a junior copywriter, right out of college, clawing my way up the corporate ladder through pure grit and flawless execution. I sat at my mahogany desk sipping my black coffee, reviewing the final slide deck when my inbox chimed a loud notification. A calendar invite popped up with the subject line, "Urgent meeting in boardroom A." The attendees were just Julian, our chief executive officer, and Brenda, the head of human resources. A cold knot immediately formed deep in my stomach. In the corporate world, you do not get called into the glass-walled boardroom by the CEO and HR to get a promotion. You get called in execution fodder. I grabbed my tablet and walked across the sprawling open concept floor. The glass walls of Boardroom A offered absolutely no privacy. Everyone in the bullpen could see inside. When I opened the heavy oak door, the silence in the room was suffocating. Julian did not offer his usual warm smile or ask about my weekend. He sat rigidly at the head of the long marble table, his hands folded tightly over a thick manila folder. Brenda sat next to him, her posture stiff and her face devoid of any human emotion. I took the seat opposite them, the expensive leather chair squeaking loudly in the quiet room. Julian looked at me with a sickening mixture of disgust and profound disappointment. He opened the folder and slid a stack of freshly printed papers across the polished marble. I looked down. My brow furrowed in genuine confusion. They were emails, printouts of long email threads bearing my exact corporate signature, my direct phone number, and my official title. I read the top page and my vision instantly blurred. The email was dated 3 months ago. It was addressed to an external vendor, strictly instructing them to strip the digital watermarks of a series of proprietary creative mock-ups and reformat them entirely under the Zenith Media letterhead. I scanned the next page, my hands beginning to shake. It was an invoice approval for an independent consultant attached directly to the exact pitch deck I had just finished presenting to the board the week prior. I looked up at Julian, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I told him I did not write these emails. I explained frantically that I had built this campaign from the ground up, that every single spreadsheet wireframe and graphic asset was safely stored on my encrypted local drive. Julian shook his head slowly, his expression hardening into stone. He tapped the paper heavily and told me the digital forensics team had already verified the IP addresses. The emails came from my personal home network. I felt all the blood drain rapidly from my face. I lived alone in a secured downtown apartment. No one had access to my secure home network except my immediate family. Brenda leaned forward and placed another official document on top of the pile. It was a completed federal tax form for the independent consultant I had supposedly stolen the entire $50 million campaign from. I stared at the name printed in bold black ink, and my stomach completely dropped. Sierra Marketing Solutions. Sierra, my 29-year-old sister, the same sister who had dropped out of 3 different state colleges, the sister who currently ran a failing lifestyle blog, who had never worked a day in a corporate office, and who was drowning in massive credit card debt. I started to laugh, a dry, hysterical sound that echoed off the thick glass walls. I told Julian this had to be a massive mistake or a sick joke. I explained that Sierra was my younger sister, that she had absolutely no background in corporate marketing, no portfolio, no clients, and that she must have cloned my laptop when she visited my apartment last month for a Sunday family dinner. I vividly remembered leaving my work computer open and unlocked on the kitchen island, while I turned my back to pour us glasses of wine. Julian stood up his chair, scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He said they had already spoken to Sierra directly. He claimed Sierra came to their downtown office yesterday in tears, providing digital timestamps, early rough drafts, and recorded voice memos proving she was the original creator of the campaign. She had spun a heartbreaking story about how her older, powerful sister had aggressively leveraged her corporate position to steal the credit and threaten her into silence. The room started to spin out of control. Sierra had completely fabricated a digital trail of breadcrumbs. She had weaponized my own ambition against me. Julian did not care about my 8 years of flawless performance reviews. He did not care about the millions of dollars in revenue I had generated for the firm. He only cared about mitigating corporate liability. He informed me in a voice entirely devoid of warmth that my employment was terminated effective immediately for gross misconduct and intellectual property theft. But the nightmare did not stop there. Brenda coldly added that because the campaign was a highly visible public sector contract, the company was legally obligated to disclose the intellectual property dispute to their stakeholders. They had already drafted a press release distancing Zenith Media from my alleged criminal actions. My name was going out to every trade publication competitor and agency in the country within the hour. My industry reputation was being vaporized in real time. I was not even allowed to return to my desk to retrieve my belongings. A security guard named Marcus, a kind man I used to buy coffee for on Friday mornings, was already waiting just outside the boardroom doors. Brenda handed me a single cardboard box containing my personal framed photos, my favorite ceramic mug, and my spare gym shoes. Marcus escorted me through the bullpen like a common criminal. The entire floor had gone dead silent. 50 of my colleagues' people I had mentored, promoted, and celebrated with stared at me through the glass partitions. Some looked away in shame. Others whispered behind their hands. I held my head high, forcing my shaking legs to keep moving forward, but inside my reality was violently shattering into pieces. Every late night in the office, every cancelled vacation, every ounce of blind loyalty I gave to this company was instantly erased by a lie so audacious it literally took my breath away. The heavy glass doors of the lobby closed behind me with a final echoing thud. I stood alone on the bustling sidewalk, the cold Chicago wind biting through my thin silk blouse. The city moved quickly around me, completely indifferent to the undeniable fact that my life had just been destroyed. I clutched the cheap cardboard box tightly to my chest, struggling to pull any air into my burning lungs. My career was gone. My pristine reputation was ruined. I was effectively blacklisted from the only industry I knew how to navigate. But the sheer paralyzing panic was quickly being swallowed by a massive, blinding wave of pure rage. Sierra had gone way too far this time. This was not a stolen designer sweater or a borrowed car returned with an empty gas tank. This was my entire livelihood. This was my identity. My hands trembled violently as I pulled my phone from my coat pocket. I bypassed the contacts for my lawyer, my former colleagues, and my friends. I dialed my parents' house. My mother answered on the second ring, her voice bright and cheerful. I prepared to tell her everything, fully expecting her to finally see the manipulative monster she had raised. I expected her to drive straight downtown, drag Sierra by the ear into the Zenith Media lobby, and force her to confess the entire scheme to my CEO. I expected my family to protect me. The drive to my parents' house in the wealthy suburbs of Oakbrook usually took 40 minutes, but today it felt like I was moving through a dark blur of absolute panic. I gripped the leather steering wheel of my car so tightly that my fingers went completely numb. The entire way there, I kept replaying the boardroom ambush in my mind. I saw the fake emails. I saw the forged tax documents. I felt the cold stare of my chief executive officer as he told me my career was over. But beneath the shock, there was a desperate thread of hope. I believed my parents would save me. I believed that once they heard what Sierra had done, they would be absolutely horrified. I expected my father to call his high-powered legal contacts to clear my name. I expected my mother to drive straight to my apartment and hold me while I cried. I pulled into the sweeping circular driveway of their sprawling estate. The manicured green lawns and the massive oak trees looked exactly the same as they did when I was a child. It was a fortress of wealth and pristine reputation. It was a place where problems were supposed to be solved with money and influence. I left my cardboard box of office belongings on the passenger seat and walked up the stone steps to the heavy double doors. I did not bother to ring the doorbell. I pushed my way inside and stepped into the grand foyer. The familiar scent of vanilla and expensive lemon polish filled the air. I walked straight into the formal living room, expecting to find them going about their quiet afternoon routine. I found them waiting. My mother was sitting perfectly straight on the white linen sofa. She was wearing her usual cashmere sweater and pearls, sipping herbal tea from a delicate porcelain cup. My father was standing by the large bay window, adjusting the gold cufflinks on his crisp dress shirt. They did not look surprised to see me. They did not look alarmed by my pale face or my shaking hands. In fact, my father slowly checked his luxury watch as if I was arriving precisely on a schedule they had already planned. I stood in the doorway trembling from the adrenaline. I started talking immediately. The words poured out of me in a frantic rush. I told them everything that just happened downtown. I told them Julian fired me. I told them Sierra completely fabricated a digital trail and stole my $50 million marketing campaign. I begged my father to help me prove she cloned my laptop during our Sunday family dinner last month. I pleaded with my mother to call Sierra and demand she confess the truth to Zenith Media. Neither of them moved. Neither of them offered a single word of comfort. My mother carefully set her teacup down on the glass coffee table. There was absolutely no outrage in her eyes. There was no maternal instinct to protect her eldest daughter. Instead, she looked at me with a profound sense of exhaustion, as if I was a difficult teenager throwing a tantrum over something trivial. My father sighed heavily. He walked over to his massive mahogany desk in the corner of the room. He picked up a thick stack of papers bound in a blue legal folder. He walked back across the plush Persian rug and held the folder out toward me. He told me in a low, flat voice to sit down and stop being so dramatic. I took the folder with trembling hands. My eyes scanned the bold black text printed across the top of the very first page. It was a non-disclosure agreement. It was a legally binding corporate contract drafted by my father's personal attorney. It was completely customized with my full legal name and my social security number. I looked up at him completely paralyzed. I asked him what this was and why he had it. My mother smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her trousers. She looked me dead in the eye and delivered the most devastating sentence of my entire life. She said they already knew. They knew everything. They knew Sierra came to my apartment that night with a hidden flash drive. They knew Sierra waited until my back was turned in the kitchen to access my files. They knew because they were the ones who told her to do it. The floor beneath me felt like it was violently splitting open. My own parents were not innocent bystanders. They were active accomplices in the total destruction of my career. They had helped plan the execution. I felt the air leave my lungs. I demanded to know why they would help her steal my entire livelihood. My father spoke to me using his sharpest banking tone. He explained it as if we were discussing a simple real estate transaction. He said Sierra was drowning financially. Her luxury lifestyle boutique was completely failing. She was paying rent on a storefront that saw 0 customers. She had secretly taken out massive business loans she could not possibly repay. But worse than the debt was her husband Marcus. Marcus was a brilliant and relentless investigative journalist. My father explained that Marcus was already asking very dangerous questions. He was noticing the missing funds, the hidden bank statements, and the maxed-out credit cards. My father said if Marcus found out the truth about her failing business, he would divorce her immediately and leave her with absolutely nothing. My mother leaned forward and placed her cold hand over mine. She said Sierra desperately needed a massive victory to secure a lucrative consulting contract and save her marriage. She needed Zenith Media to pay her out as an independent consultant. My mother looked at me with cold calculation and said, Sierra is incredibly fragile. She cannot handle failure, Harper. But you are strong. You have always been the strong one. My father nodded in agreement. He told me I was highly educated and deeply resilient. He said I would easily bounce back and find another marketing job in a different city. He told me I had to take this temporary loss for the sake of the family. He pointed to the thick blue folder in my hands. He told me to sign the non-disclosure agreement. He told me to accept the firing, stay completely silent, and let my sister have the campaign to save her life. The sheer audacity of their logic was suffocating. They were asking me to willingly step into a professional grave just to hide my sister's financial incompetence from her own husband. They wanted me to accept public humiliation, a ruined reputation, and total financial instability so their golden child could continue playing pretend. They viewed my hard work as nothing more than a resource they could harvest and give to Sierra whenever she needed a bailout. The crushing sadness I felt just moments ago completely evaporated. A dark, burning fury took its place. It started in my chest and spread rapidly through my veins. I looked at the expensive silver pen my father was now holding out to me. I looked at the meticulously typed pages meant to silence my voice forever. I stood up slowly. I let the thick blue folder drop from my hands. It hit the hardwood floor with a loud, echoing smack. I looked directly into my father's eyes. I told them they were completely out of their minds. I told them I was not going to sign a single piece of paper. I told them I was not going to fall on my sword for a sister who actively chose to destroy my life. My father's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He stepped squarely into my personal space, attempting to use his physical height to intimidate me into submission. He pointed a finger at my chest. He told me I was being incredibly selfish and vindictive. He said if I fought this, I would tear the entire family apart and the blame would rest solely on my shoulders. I did not back down a single inch. I looked right past him at my mother, who was now standing up with a look of genuine panic. I told her I no longer had a family to tear apart. I told them I had a massive emergency legal fund sitting in my high-yield savings account. I promised them I was going to hire the most vicious and expensive corporate litigation attorney in the entire state of Illinois. I was going to subpoena every single digital log, every email server, and every IP address. I was going to drag all three of them into civil court and expose their entire fraudulent operation to the public. I turned around and walked out of the formal living room without looking back. My mother called after me, her voice finally cracking with fear. She warned me not to do something I would permanently regret. I completely ignored her. I walked out the heavy oak doors and let them slam violently shut behind me. I marched down the stone steps and back to my car with my heart pounding a steady rhythm of absolute war. I was not going to be their sacrificial lamb anymore. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. I vowed right then and there that I was going to use every single dollar I had to burn their perfect illusion to the ground. The drive back to my apartment was a blur. The adrenaline from the confrontation was wearing off, leaving behind cold determination. I walked inside and threw my coat onto the sofa. I did not bother to turn on the lights. The glowing screen of my laptop was the only illumination. I sat at my kitchen island and immediately started searching for the most ruthless corporate litigation firms in Chicago. I was not going to let them take my life without a massive fight. After an hour of intense research, I found him, Arthur Vance, a high-profile attorney known for absolutely destroying his opponents in intellectual property disputes. I drafted an urgent email detailing the stolen campaign, the forged documents, and the termination. I hit send and waited. Less than 20 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Arthur himself. He listened in complete silence. When I finished, he told me I had a highly actionable case, but his services did not come cheap. He required an immediate retainer of $25,000 to begin drafting the subpoenas and filing the injunction against Zenith Media. I did not hesitate for a single second. I told him I would wire the money immediately. I hung up the phone feeling a sudden surge of powerful validation. I was going to crush Sierra and expose my parents. I opened a new tab on my browser and navigated to the login page of my primary financial institution. I had been diligently saving money since my very first internship. I sacrificed expensive vacations and designer clothes to build a massive safety net. My high-yield savings account held exactly $120,000. It was the physical manifestation of my adult life of hard work and discipline. I typed in my username and password with flying fingers. The loading circle spun for a few seconds before displaying a red error message. Access denied, account frozen. I frowned and tried again, assuming I had simply mistyped my password in my haste. Access denied. A cold spike of anxiety pierced my chest. I quickly picked up my phone and opened the mobile banking application. The app utilized facial recognition, so there was no possibility of a typing error. The screen authenticated my face and loaded my dashboard. What I saw made the air completely vanish from the room. My checking account balance was zero. My high-yield savings account balance was zero. My emergency fund was gone. Every single account showed a flat absolute zero. My hands began to shake so violently, I nearly dropped the phone. This had to be a technical glitch. The bank must have flagged the sudden login attempts or frozen the accounts due to a system error. I frantically tapped on the transaction history tab for my savings account, praying to see a simple pending hold. Instead, my eyes locked onto a completed outbound wire transfer dated just 3 hours ago. The exact time I was standing in my parents' living room refusing to sign their non-disclosure agreement. The recipient of the wire transfer was listed clearly in bold letters: Sierra Marketing Solutions Limited Liability Company. The transaction amount was exactly $120,000. The authorization code attached to the wire was not my digital signature. It was a joint account holder override. A memory from 14 years ago hit me like a physical blow. When I was 18 years old, heading off to my freshman year of college, my father had taken me to this exact bank to open my first adult checking account. He was a senior executive at a rival financial institution at the time. He insisted on setting everything up for me to ensure I received the best interest rates. He casually slipped his name onto the paperwork as a secondary joint account holder, claiming it was just a standard safety measure in case of emergencies. Over the last decade, I had built my career, deposited every bonus, and grown my wealth completely, forgetting that the man who raised me still held the master key to my financial independence. I felt violently sick. I grabbed my phone and dialed my father's private cell phone number. He answered on the first ring, as if he had been sitting in his quiet study, just waiting for the explosion. I screamed into the receiver, demanding to know what he had done. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. He spoke with the chilling calm of a man who believed he was entirely justified in his cruelty. He told me that since I was choosing to be litigious, he had to take drastic measures to protect the family from legal fallout. He said I was clearly experiencing a severe mental breakdown over losing my job and could not be trusted with significant financial assets. He claimed the transfer to Sierra's company was a protective measure to ensure the money was safe from any frivolous lawsuits I might file. I could hear my mother in the background telling him to hang up. He told me I brought this upon myself by refusing to be a team player. Then the line went dead. I dropped the phone and sank to the kitchen floor, pulling my knees tightly to my chest. The rent for my downtown apartment was due in exactly 4 days, and it was $5,000 a month. I had no job. I had no severance package. I had absolutely no savings left. My corporate credit cards had been deactivated the moment I was fired, and my personal credit cards were set to auto-pay from the checking account that was now entirely empty. In less than 8 hours, my own flesh and blood had systematically dismantled my career, destroyed my professional reputation, and executed a flawless financial guillotine. I was utterly alone, broke, and staring down the barrel of imminent eviction. Also, my sister could buy herself a little more time in her pathetic fantasy world. 2 weeks passed in a blinding haze of sheer, terrifying survival. Every single morning, I woke up to the exact same crushing reality, staring me right in the face. My primary bank accounts were entirely empty. My high-yield emergency fund was completely gone stolen by the very man who was supposed to unconditionally protect me from harm. The digital calendar on my cell phone was no longer filled with high-stakes marketing strategy meetings or vibrant creative brainstorming sessions with my brilliant team. It was a terrifying ticking countdown to my absolute ruin. A bright neon red eviction notice was taped securely to the inside of my heavy wooden apartment door, mocking me every time I walked past it. I had exactly 3 days left before the building management company changed the brass locks and dragged my few remaining personal possessions onto the filthy downtown Chicago pavement. I was barely surviving on cheap instant ramen and lukewarm tap water, carefully rationing every single bite because I did not have a single spare dollar left to buy fresh groceries. The heavy silence in my dark apartment was entirely deafening. My parents did not call to check on me. Sierra did not text to apologize. They had successfully discarded me like a piece of broken machinery. But I fiercely refused to let them win this war. I spent every single waking hour aggressively sending my digital portfolio to every major marketing agency located in the greater Midwest. I willfully ignored the highly damaging leaked Zenith media press release, currently circulating wildly on LinkedIn and industry message boards. I had to desperately believe that my raw creative talent and my 8 consecutive years of undeniable industry success would somehow outweigh one vicious fabricated lie. Finally, a tiny, fragile lifeline miraculously appeared out of nowhere. Vanguard Communications, a massive high-profile rival firm located just across the river, called me directly for an exclusive in-person interview. They were desperately looking for a seasoned senior director to permanently lead their brand new tech division. It was my exact, highly specialized niche. This was my one and only chance to violently claw my way back from the professional graveyard. I spent 3 agonizing hours meticulously preparing for the interview. I carefully steamed my best-tailored navy blue power suit and meticulously concealed the dark, exhausted circles under my eyes with heavy liquid concealer. I desperately needed to project total, unwavering confidence and absolute corporate control. I walked into the soaring modern glass lobby of Vanguard Communications with my chin held high, completely ignoring the frantic, anxious fluttering deep in my chest. The senior hiring manager was a sharp, highly intelligent woman named Evelyn. She had a terrifying reputation in the industry for being totally ruthless but incredibly fair to top performers. We sat down across from each other in her spacious, immaculate corner office overlooking the icy Chicago River. The interview actually started brilliantly. I confidently walked her through my most financially successful past campaigns, carefully omitting any mention of the recent Zenith media disaster. I boldly laid out a highly comprehensive 90-day strategic growth plan for their new tech division right there on the spot. Evelyn was clearly and genuinely impressed. She leaned forward in her expensive leather executive chair, her sharp eyes lighting up brightly as I detailed my aggressive demographic targeting strategies. She told me my unique consumer insights were exactly what Vanguard had been desperately missing for the last 2 quarters. She flatly stated she had read the vicious toxic rumors currently circulating in the weekly trade publications, but she firmly believed in judging a top-tier candidate strictly by their raw strategic capability and their undeniable in-room presence. I felt a massive, overwhelming wave of pure relief wash over my entirely exhausted, trembling body. I was actually going to get the job. I was going to successfully secure a massive signing bonus, instantly pay my overdue rent, and immediately hire the most terrifying, aggressive litigation attorney in the entire state of Illinois to utterly destroy Sierra and her fake fraudulent business. I smiled warmly at Evelyn, feeling the very first genuine spark of real hope I had felt in 14 excruciating nightmare days. I took a deep, calming breath, fully ready to aggressively negotiate my new starting salary. Evelyn opened her mouth to begin discussing the official corporate compensation package when her sleek desk phone suddenly rang with a sharp, highly urgent tone. She frowned slightly and completely ignored it, but then her heavy, solid wood office door abruptly swung open without a simple knock. Her young executive assistant walked in looking completely terrified and out of breath. He was holding a thick, heavy manila envelope stamped heavily with bright red certified priority mail labels. He apologized profusely and nervously for interrupting the private meeting, but stated the internal legal department had just frantically sent this directly upstairs with strict, unyielding instructions that Evelyn had to read it immediately. The entire air in the room instantly shifted dramatically. The warm, highly collaborative energy completely evaporated into nothingness, replaced instantly by a cold, harsh clinical tension. Evelyn took the heavy envelope and quickly sliced it open with a sharp silver letter opener. I sat perfectly still, my heart hammering violently against my bruised ribs. I watched her eyes rapidly scan the thick, dense legal document. Her facial expression morphed rapidly from mild corporate annoyance to deep, genuine concern, and finally, to absolute horrified disgust. She slowly and deliberately placed the document face down on her polished mahogany desk. She looked directly at me, and the professional warmth in her eyes was entirely gone, replaced by cold calculation. She asked me in a tight, restricted voice that was barely more than a whisper if my younger sister was currently represented by a senior corporate attorney named Richard Sterling. I felt the warm blood drain completely and instantly from my face. Richard Sterling was my wealthy father's longtime country club golf partner and absolutely one of the most aggressive, ruthless contract lawyers in the entire city of Chicago. I nodded slowly, completely unable to form a single spoken word. Evelyn picked up the document again and read the opening paragraph aloud to me. It was a highly formal, brutal cease and desist order. It explicitly and aggressively threatened Vanguard Communications with a massive multi-million-dollar corporate espionage and defamation lawsuit if they dared to hire me. The letter falsely and maliciously claimed I was currently and actively under federal criminal investigation for deliberately stealing highly proprietary intellectual property, and strictly warned that any agency employing me would immediately be considered a criminal accessory to active corporate fraud. They were not just firing me, they were actively, violently hunting me down to ensure I starved. I jumped out of my chair, my voice cracking loudly as I desperately tried to frantically explain. I told Evelyn the letter was a complete malicious fabrication. I swore to her on my life that my sister was lying and that I possessed the forensic digital evidence to prove my total, absolute innocence. But Evelyn simply held up her hand, silencing me immediately and completely. She looked at me not with human anger, but with profound, icy corporate self-preservation. She stated flatly that Vanguard Communications could absolutely not afford to entangle themselves in a massive high-profile legal battle over a brand new hire, regardless of talent. She said the legal risk was far too great and the potential public relations fallout would completely destroy their upcoming quarterly earnings report. She stood up briskly from her chair and politely but firmly asked me to leave the secure building immediately. I begged her to just give me one single week to officially clear my ruined name. I pleaded with her, telling her I was facing immediate devastating eviction and had absolutely nothing left to my name to survive on. Evelyn walked quickly over to the heavy office door and opened it wide. She told me the building security team would physically escort me out if I did not leave on my own volition right that second. The public humiliation was absolute and entirely crushing. I walked out of her corner office, feeling the intense burning stares of dozens of curious employees burning directly into my back. They had clearly heard the desperate commotion through the thin glass office walls. I marched blindly toward the executive elevator bank, my vision severely blurred with hot, angry, humiliating tears. The ride down to the main lobby felt like an absolute endless eternity. Sierra and my parents had not just simply fired me from my previous job to save her. They had actively and maliciously blacklisted me from the entire national industry. They were systematically hunting me down, ensuring I could never, ever rebuild my life or my career anywhere. They wanted me totally destitute, absolutely desperate, and completely broken, so I would have absolutely no choice but to crawl back home and blindly sign their horrific non-disclosure agreement. I stumbled out of the towering glass building and into the freezing, biting Chicago wind. I walked blindly for 6 long blocks until I found my 10-year-old sedan parked in a cheap, dark concrete alleyway garage. I climbed into the freezing driver's seat and quickly locked the heavy metal doors. The sheer, agonizing, suffocating weight of my terrifying reality finally crushed me completely. I gripped the cold steering wheel incredibly tightly and let out a loud, agonizing scream. It was a raw, guttural sound, torn straight from the deepest, darkest part of my chest. I had lost absolutely everything I had ever worked for. My career, my life savings, my pristine professional reputation, and my entire family were all completely gone in the blink of an eye. I rested my forehead heavily against the steering wheel, gasping loudly and violently for air as the warm, salty tears streamed rapidly down my face, soaking entirely into my silk collar. I was entirely, completely out of options. I had absolutely no money to fight them in civil court and absolutely no way to earn a living in my chosen specialized field. I was utterly and completely defeated. Suddenly, a loud, sharp, unexpected knock on my driver's side window made me jump violently out of my skin. I snapped my head up, wiping my wet eyes frantically with the back of my trembling, freezing hand. Standing right outside my locked car door in the dimly lit cold parking garage was a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a dark-tailored wool trench coat. I recognized him instantly through the smudged, dirty glass. It was Marcus Hayes. He was a brilliant, highly respected, award-winning investigative journalist for the Chicago Tribune. He was also a 34-year-old African-American man who happened to be legally married to my lying, manipulative, deceitful sister, Sierra. My racing heart stopped completely dead in my chest. What in the world was he doing here right now? Did my ruthless parents actually send him to intimidate me in person? Did they send him to forcefully make me sign the non-disclosure agreement and permanently drop any potential legal retaliation against the family? I rolled the window down just one single careful inch, my entire body completely tense and fully ready to fight for my life. Marcus did not look angry or threatening. He looked profoundly exhausted and deeply dangerously furious at the exact same time. He leaned down extremely close to the narrow opening of the window. He looked me dead in the eye and spoke in a low, remarkably steady voice. He said, "I know absolutely everything, Harper. I know about the stolen tech campaign and I know all about the missing money. Unlock the door right now because we have a massive amount of work to do." The drive to my parents' house in the wealthy suburbs of Oak Brook usually took 40 minutes, but today it felt like I was moving through a dark blur of absolute panic. I gripped the leather steering wheel of my car so tightly that my fingers went completely numb. The entire way there, I kept replaying the boardroom ambush in my mind. I saw the fake emails. I saw the forged tax documents. I felt the cold stare of my chief executive officer as he told me my career was over. But beneath the shock, there was a desperate thread of hope. I believed my parents would save me. I believed that once they heard what Sierra had done, they would be absolutely horrified. I expected my father to call his high-powered legal contacts to clear my name. I expected my mother to drive straight to my apartment and hold me while I cried. I pulled into the sweeping circular driveway of their sprawling estate. The manicured green lawns and the massive oak trees looked exactly the same as they did when I was a child. It was a fortress of wealth and pristine reputation. It was a place where problems were supposed to be solved with money and influence. I left my cardboard box of office belongings on the passenger seat and walked up the stone steps to the heavy double doors. I did not bother to ring the doorbell. I pushed my way inside and stepped into the grand foyer. The familiar scent of vanilla and expensive lemon polish filled the air. I walked straight into the formal living room, expecting to find them going about their quiet afternoon routine. I found them waiting. My mother was sitting perfectly straight on the white linen sofa. She was wearing her usual cashmere sweater and pearls, sipping herbal tea from a delicate porcelain cup. My father was standing by the large bay window, adjusting the gold cufflinks on his crisp dress shirt. They did not look surprised to see me. They did not look alarmed by my pale face or my shaking hands. In fact, my father slowly checked his luxury watch, as if I was arriving precisely on a schedule they had already planned. I stood in the doorway, trembling from the adrenaline. I started talking immediately. The words poured out of me in a frantic rush. I told them everything that just happened downtown. I told them Julian fired me. I told them Sierra completely fabricated a digital trail and stole my $50 million marketing campaign. I begged my father to help me prove she cloned my laptop during our Sunday family dinner last month. I pleaded with my mother to call Sierra and demand she confess the truth to Zenith Media. Neither of them moved. Neither of them offered a single word of comfort. My mother carefully set her teacup down on the glass coffee table. There was absolutely no outrage in her eyes. There was no maternal instinct to protect her eldest daughter. Instead, she looked at me with a profound sense of exhaustion, as if I was a difficult teenager throwing a tantrum over something trivial. My father sighed heavily. He walked over to his massive mahogany desk in the corner of the room. He picked up a thick stack of papers bound in a blue legal folder. He walked back across the plush Persian rug and held the folder out toward me. He told me in a low, flat voice to sit down and stop being so dramatic. I took the folder with trembling hands. My eyes scanned the bold black text printed across the top of the very first page. It was a non-disclosure agreement. It was a legally binding corporate contract drafted by my father's personal attorney. It was completely customized with my full legal name and my social security number. I looked up at him completely paralyzed. I asked him what this was and why he had it. My mother smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her trousers. She looked me dead in the eye and delivered the most devastating sentence of my entire life. She said they already knew. They knew everything. They knew Sierra came to my apartment that night with a hidden flash drive. They knew Sierra waited until my back was turned in the kitchen to access my files. They knew because they were the ones who told her to do it. The floor beneath me felt like it was violently splitting open. My own parents were not innocent bystanders. They were active accomplices in the total destruction of my career. They had helped plan the execution. I felt the air leave my lungs. I demanded to know why they would help her steal my entire livelihood. My father spoke to me using his sharpest banking tone. He explained it as if we were discussing a simple real estate transaction. He said Sierra was drowning financially. Her luxury lifestyle boutique was completely failing. She was paying rent on a storefront that saw 0 customers. She had secretly taken out massive business loans she could not possibly repay. But worse than the debt was her husband Marcus. Marcus was a brilliant and relentless investigative journalist. My father explained that Marcus was already asking very dangerous questions. He was noticing the missing funds, the hidden bank statements, and the maxed-out credit cards. My father said if Marcus found out the truth about her failing business, he would divorce her immediately and leave her with absolutely nothing. My mother leaned forward and placed her cold hand over mine. She said Sierra desperately needed a massive victory to secure a lucrative consulting contract and save her marriage. She needed Zenith Media to pay her out as an independent consultant. My mother looked at me with cold calculation and said, Sierra is incredibly fragile. She cannot handle failure, Harper, but you are strong. You have always been the strong one. My father nodded in agreement. He told me I was highly educated and deeply resilient. He said I would easily bounce back and find another marketing job in a different city. He told me I had to take this temporary loss for the sake of the family. He pointed to the thick blue folder in my hands. He told me to sign the non-disclosure agreement. He told me to accept the firing, stay completely silent, and let my sister have the campaign to save her life. The sheer audacity of their logic was suffocating. They were asking me to willingly step into a professional grave just to hide my sister's financial incompetence from her own husband. They wanted me to accept public humiliation, a ruined reputation, and total financial instability so their golden child could continue playing pretend. They viewed my hard work as nothing more than a resource they could harvest and give to Sierra whenever she needed a bailout. The crushing sadness I felt just moments ago completely evaporated. A dark, burning fury took its place. It started in my chest and spread rapidly through my veins. I looked at the expensive silver pen my father was now holding out to me. I looked at the meticulously typed pages meant to silence my voice forever. I stood up slowly. I let the thick blue folder drop from my hands. It hit the hardwood floor with a loud, echoing smack. I looked directly into my father's eyes. I told them they were completely out of their minds. I told them I was not going to sign a single piece of paper. I told them I was not going to fall on my sword for a sister who actively chose to destroy my life. My father's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He stepped squarely into my personal space, attempting to use his physical height to intimidate me into submission. He pointed a finger at my chest. He told me I was being incredibly selfish and vindictive. He said if I fought this, I would tear the entire family apart, and the blame would rest solely on my shoulders. I did not back down a single inch. I looked right past him at my mother, who was now standing up with a look of genuine panic. I told her I no longer had a family to tear apart. I told them I had a massive emergency legal fund sitting in my high-yield savings account. I promised them I was going to hire the most vicious and expensive corporate litigation attorney in the entire state of Illinois. I was going to subpoena every single digital log, every email server, and every IP address. I was going to drag all 3 of them into civil court and expose their entire fraudulent operation to the public. I turned around and walked out of the formal living room without looking back. My mother called after me, her voice finally cracking with fear. She warned me not to do something I would permanently regret. I completely ignored her. I walked out the heavy oak doors and let them slam violently shut behind me. I marched down the stone steps and back to my car with my heart pounding a steady rhythm of absolute war. I was not going to be their sacrificial lamb anymore. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. I vowed right then and there that I was going to use every single dollar I had to burn their perfect illusion to the ground. I sat completely paralyzed in the passenger seat of Marcus's dark vehicle as we navigated the icy rain-slicked streets of Chicago. The heavy heater was blasting on maximum, but my entire body was trembling violently. Marcus kept his hands gripped tightly on the steering wheel, his eyes locked dead ahead. He spoke in a low, steady rhythm, explaining the exact logistics of what we were about to do. He told me that my parents and Sierra had boarded a luxury direct flight to Napa Valley just 3 hours ago. They were currently drinking premium champagne at 30,000 feet, actively celebrating my professional execution and Sierra's brand new fake corporate empire. Marcus explained that he had suspected his wife was hiding serious financial problems for the past 6 months. He had noticed the massive credit card bills, the strange late-night phone calls from debt collectors, and the sheer panic in her eyes whenever he asked to see the profit margins. But when he accidentally uncovered the hidden bank statement showing the sudden transfer of my entire life savings into her account, he finally realized the terrifying magnitude of her deception. He knew he had to act immediately before she dragged him down with her. He pulled the heavy car into a narrow, pitch-black alleyway situated directly behind the upscale retail district of Lincoln Park. The freezing rain battered the windshield, relentlessly mirroring the absolute chaos, violently tearing through my mind. We sat in the dark alleyway for a long moment, listening to the rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers. Marcus turned to me and handed me a pair of thin black latex gloves. He instructed me to put them on and touch absolutely nothing inside the office, unless he specifically told me to. He was a seasoned investigative journalist who had spent his entire career exposing corrupt politicians and massive corporate frauds. He knew exactly how to preserve digital evidence and maintain a pristine chain of custody. He pulled out his smartphone and typed in a complex sequence of numbers to silently disable the external security cameras and the internal motion sensors. He had secretly copied Sierra's master set of keys the night before while she was busy packing her designer luggage for California. We stepped out of the warm vehicle and directly into the freezing, biting wind. The heavy steel security door at the back of the boutique looked incredibly intimidating, but Marcus unlocked the deadbolt with terrifying ease. We slipped inside quickly and quietly, pulling the heavy door firmly shut behind us to block out the howling wind. The immediate silence inside the building was thick and entirely suffocating. I stood perfectly still in the dark, allowing my eyes to adjust slowly to the faint amber glow of the streetlights, filtering through the front display windows. We carefully navigated our way through the main showroom floor of the boutique. The space was an absolute monument to Sierra's endless, staggering delusions of grandeur. Racks of incredibly expensive imported silk dresses hung perfectly spaced under custom crystal chandeliers. Massive velvet couches and marble coffee tables were meticulously arranged to create the illusion of a highly exclusive high society shopping experience. But the reality was that nobody ever actually shopped here. The physical inventory was just a glamorous theatrical prop designed solely to stroke her massive, fragile ego and project a completely fabricated image of wealth and ultimate success to her wealthy friends. I felt a sickening wave of deep disgust wash over me as I brushed past a rack of coats that cost more than my monthly rent. My parents had actively chosen to protect this pathetic, hollow illusion over my actual, tangible 8-year career. We bypassed the luxurious showroom and walked down a narrow hallway toward her private locked office. Marcus produced a second, smaller brass key and opened the heavy frosted glass door. The office was surprisingly messy, a sharp contrast to the pristine, curated showroom out front. Stacks of unopened mail, unpaid vendor invoices, and past-due utility bills were haphazardly piled across a massive white quartz desk. This was the hidden, chaotic reality of her failing business. Marcus walked straight over to her sleek silver desktop computer and hit the power button. The massive high-definition monitor flared to life, casting a harsh bright white glow across the dark room. He pulled a heavy leather desk chair over for me and told me to sit down and watch the screen carefully. He did not bother guessing her password. He simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small black USB drive loaded with a highly specialized boot, bypassing software he frequently utilized for his investigative reporting. He plugged the drive directly into the back of the machine and rapidly typed a series of complex commands into a stark black terminal window. Within less than 60 seconds, the computer completely bypassed the encrypted login screen and opened directly to her main desktop. I leaned forward, my heart hammering violently against my bruised ribs. The digital landscape of her computer was just as chaotic as her physical desk. Dozens of random folders and loosely saved documents littered the screen. Marcus immediately opened the primary file explorer and typed my name into the main search bar. He hit the enter key, and we waited in breathless, terrifying silence. A few seconds later, a massive encrypted folder labeled Zenith Media Acquisition popped up on the screen. Marcus clicked on the folder, and a massive wall of undeniable digital evidence instantly filled the screen. There they were, every single piece of my stolen $50 million national tech campaign. My meticulous demographic spreadsheets, my highly detailed financial projections, my custom wireframes, and my proprietary graphic design assets were all sitting right there, perfectly intact. I saw the exact digital timestamp proving she had copied these files onto a hidden flash drive directly from my home network on the exact Sunday afternoon I had hosted my family for dinner. I saw the raw, unedited audio files where she had practiced mimicking my specific corporate jargon to successfully fool my chief executive officer. I even saw the original draft of the highly sophisticated, fabricated email chain she used to completely destroy my professional reputation. Seeing my actual stolen work physically manifested right there on her screen sent a massive wave of burning vindication and absolute fury rushing through my veins. I reached out a shaking hand to touch the glowing monitor. I told Marcus this was absolutely everything we needed. I told him we could take these files straight to my lawyer first thing tomorrow morning and completely clear my ruined name. I thought the nightmare was finally over, but Marcus did not smile. He did not look relieved. He simply shook his head slowly, his eyes dark and incredibly grim. Marcus kept his hand firmly on the wireless mouse. He looked at me with a deeply terrifying expression of absolute dread. He told me the stolen marketing files were just the tip of a massive catastrophic iceberg. He said stealing my intellectual property was just a desperate secondary crime designed to cover up a much darker and vastly more dangerous reality. He backed out of the Zenith Media folder and navigated deep into a hidden partition on her hard drive labeled simply Accounting Archive. He opened the folder, revealing hundreds of highly detailed digital bank statements, tax forms, and legal contracts. Marcus began opening the documents one by one, rapidly displaying them on the screen for me to read. My eyes frantically scanned the dense columns of numbers, and my breathing completely stopped. Sierra was not just failing to make a profit. She was bleeding cash at an absolutely staggering, horrifying rate. She owed tens of thousands of dollars to high-interest private lenders. She had completely maxed out 12 different platinum corporate credit cards. She was over 6 months behind on the commercial rent for the boutique, and the building management company had already filed a preliminary eviction notice. The $120,000 my father had maliciously stolen from my emergency savings account was already entirely gone, immediately swallowed whole by her massive, suffocating mountain of toxic debt. The sheer scale of the financial devastation was absolutely impossible to comprehend. How could one single person accumulate this much debt without completely imploding? But the absolute worst was yet to come. Marcus opened a highly secured subfolder labeled Federal Business Funding. He clicked on the very first document, which appeared to be a massive, highly detailed commercial loan application. He scrolled slowly down to the applicant information section, and my entire world violently stopped spinning. My heart slammed into my throat. The primary applicant name, printed clearly in bold black letters, was not Sierra Hayes. It was Harper Thompson. My name, my exact date of birth, my current home address. And right there, typed clearly into the primary identification box, was my highly confidential 9-digit social security number. I gasped loudly, bringing both my shaking hands up to cover my mouth. Sierra had not just stolen my hard-earned money and my professional career, she had completely stolen my entire legal identity. I stared blindly at the massive loan amount requested at the top of the official document, $300,000. She had successfully taken out a massive federal business loan using my completely clean, immaculate credit history. The blood roared so loudly in my ears, I could barely hear Marcus speaking. He clicked on the next document in the folder. It was a second commercial loan application, this one from a highly predatory private lending institution. The applicant was me again. The requested amount was another $200,000. She had systematically and repeatedly committed massive identity theft to fund her pathetic failing lifestyle boutique. I frantically leaned closer to the bright screen, my eyes scanning the heavily forged signature lines at the very bottom of the legal pages. The digital signatures perfectly mimicked my own handwriting. But what completely broke me, what entirely shattered the last remaining fragment of my soul, was the secondary guarantor section located on the final page of the loan documents. In order to secure such massive amounts of money, the banks required additional verified character references and financial co-signers. And right there, clearly signed and officially notarized with undeniable digital timestamps, were the legal signatures of my mother and my father. They had fully co-signed the fraudulent loans. They had actively provided their own banking credentials to help Sierra successfully steal my identity. They knew absolutely everything. When I stood in their pristine living room begging for their help, when they coldly handed me that terrifying non-disclosure agreement, they were not just protecting Sierra from Marcus divorcing her. They were actively, violently protecting themselves from going to federal prison. If I had blindly signed that non-disclosure agreement, I would have legally accepted full total responsibility for over $500,000 in highly fraudulent defaulted commercial debt. They were fully planning to let the banks come after me. They were completely willing to let me take the entire catastrophic fall for their precious golden child. The absolute sheer magnitude of their profound, terrifying betrayal was entirely paralyzing. I had spent my entire adult life desperately trying to make them proud of me. I had paid their medical bills, fixed their roof, and constantly sacrificed my own happiness just to earn a single scrap of their genuine affection. And in return, they had systematically conspired to completely destroy my life, my finances, and my legal freedom without a single ounce of hesitation or human remorse. They viewed me as nothing more than a disposable sacrificial lamb. Marcus quickly inserted a second secure flash drive into the computer and began rapidly downloading every single forged signature, every IP log, and every single stolen marketing asset. He worked in absolute total silence, his face a rigid mask of cold, furious determination. I sat frozen in the leather chair, staring blindly at the dark wall behind the computer monitor. A profound fundamental shift was happening deep inside my core. The devastated, heartbroken daughter who had walked into this dark boutique 20 minutes ago was completely dead. She had been entirely vaporized by the sheer heat of this apocalyptic betrayal. In her place, a cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless survivor was rapidly taking form. This was no longer just a toxic, painful family dispute over stolen campaign ideas. This was no longer a simple civil matter of corporate sabotage. This was a massive, highly orchestrated, multi-level federal crime. Identity theft, wire fraud, bank fraud, and criminal conspiracy. These were incredibly serious federal felonies, carrying mandatory maximum prison sentences. I watched the green progress bar rapidly filling up on the computer screen as the massive cache of highly incriminating digital evidence transferred safely onto Marcus's drive. I realized with absolute terrifying clarity exactly what was currently at stake. The moment those fraudulent, massive commercial loans inevitably defaulted, the federal authorities and the vicious private debt collectors would come looking directly for me. They would see my stolen name and my stolen social security number on all the official paperwork. If I did not strike back immediately with absolutely overwhelming, undeniable force, I would be completely framed for the entire massive criminal operation. I would be the one violently dragged out of my apartment in handcuffs. I would be the one facing decades in a federal penitentiary, while Sierra and my parents continued living their luxurious, pathetic lie in their wealthy suburbs. I stood up slowly from the leather chair. The violent trembling in my hands had completely vanished. The blinding panic had entirely dissolved, replaced by a deeply chilling, absolute clarity. I looked down at Marcus as he safely ejected the flash drive and slipped it securely into his coat pocket. I told him we were not just going to sue them in civil court. We were going to completely annihilate them. We were going to build an ironclad, absolutely inescapable trap, and we were going to execute it on the biggest, most public stage possible. We were going to burn their entire fake empire to the ground and ensure they never, ever saw the outside of a federal prison cell again. Marcus looked up at me and nodded slowly. The digital break-in was complete. The ultimate war had officially begun. I spent the entire agonizing night wide awake, sitting completely still on the cold hardwood floor of my dark apartment, meticulously rehearsing the absolute most important performance of my entire life. Marcus and I had successfully secured the massive mountain of digital evidence from the locked boutique, but we were still missing one absolutely crucial element to execute our trap. We needed immediate capital. My high-yield savings account had been completely drained by my own father, and the ruthless federal defense attorney we selected required a massive upfront retainer just to officially launch the tactical legal strike. I needed money immediately, and the absolute darkest irony of this entire nightmare was that the only people who could unknowingly fund my legal war were the exact same people who had violently stolen my life savings in the first place. I had to somehow convince my toxic family that their relentless psychological warfare had completely broken my spirit. I had to look entirely defeated, broken, and completely destitute. I purposely wore the exact same wrinkled navy blue suit trousers and plain white blouse I had been wearing for 2 solid days. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and rubbed my eyes aggressively until the delicate skin was bruised, bloodshot, and heavily swollen, perfectly mimicking the physical aftermath of a severe, sustained emotional breakdown. I deliberately messed up my hair, letting it hang in limp, tangled strands around my pale face. I drove back to the wealthy, pristine suburbs of Oakbrook, gripping the worn leather steering wheel with hands that were finally completely steady. The blinding panic that had paralyzed me yesterday was entirely gone. I was no longer an exhausted victim, desperately seeking parental comfort and protection. I was a highly strategic, calculating predator, walking willingly into a gilded cage full of incredibly arrogant, complacent prey. The drive felt remarkably short. I pulled my battered 10-year-old sedan into the sweeping circular driveway just as the evening sun began to set, casting long, dark, ominous shadows across their perfectly manicured green lawn. My parents and Sierra had returned from their luxurious celebratory Napa Valley weekend getaway just hours prior. I knew this because Marcus had been actively tracking their expensive first-class flight itinerary. I walked slowly up the wide stone steps and pushed open the heavy double mahogany doors deliberately, letting my shoulders slump forward in a posture of total, absolute defeat. I did not bother calling out to announce my arrival. I dragged my feet across the polished marble floor of the grand foyer and walked directly into the formal living room. I found all 3 of them sitting together in the opulent space. Sierra was casually lounging on the expansive white linen sofa, sipping a large glass of expensive red wine while scrolling mindlessly through her brand new designer smartphone. My mother and father were seated across from her in matching leather armchairs, looking incredibly relaxed and deeply satisfied with their stolen wealth. When I stepped heavily into the room, the casual, light-hearted conversation instantly ceased. The silence was thick and immediate. Sierra looked up from her glowing screen and a wide, incredibly vicious, victorious smirk slowly spread across her perfectly contoured face. She did not even try to hide her absolute delight at my disheveled, pathetic appearance. My mother stiffened immediately, placing her delicate crystal wine glass down on the glass coffee table with a sharp, echoing clink. She crossed her arms tightly over her cashmere sweater, her eyes narrowing in deep suspicion. My father stood up abruptly, smoothing the front of his expensive tailored trousers. His facial expression instantly morphed into a cold, unyielding, defensive mask. He demanded to know in a harsh, booming voice exactly why I was back in his house after threatening them so aggressively just 2 days ago. I knew I had to act immediately before they could completely raise their guard. I did not scream. I did not argue. I did not demand justice. Instead, I let my knees buckle slightly, and I forced a loud, ragged, wet sob from the deepest, darkest part of my chest. I buried my face completely in my trembling hands, allowing the heavy tears I had carefully manufactured to stream freely and visibly down my pale cheeks. I dropped heavily to my knees right there on the expensive Persian rug. I told them through heavy, gasping, pathetic breaths that they had completely won the war. I told them the brutal industry blacklist had entirely destroyed my professional prospects and that I was completely facing imminent, devastating eviction from my downtown apartment by the end of the week. I told them I had absolutely no money left to hire a lawyer and no energy left to fight them in court. I walked slowly over to my father's massive solid wood desk, dragging my feet like a condemned prisoner. I picked up the thick blue legal folder containing the terrifying corporate non-disclosure agreement. My hands shook violently and uncontrollably, playing the demanding part of a totally broken woman to absolute flawless perfection. I looked directly into my father's cold, calculating eyes and told him I was completely exhausted and entirely done fighting his endless resources. I told him I just wanted the relentless, suffocating nightmare to finally stop. My father's cold, defensive posture instantly melted into a sickening display of profound, arrogant relief. He actually believed his brutal financial intimidation tactics had flawlessly succeeded. He handed me his expensive, heavy silver fountain pen with a deeply condescending, paternal smile. He told me I was finally making a mature, highly rational decision for the greater good of the entire family. I took the heavy, cold pen and flipped slowly to the final signature page of the highly restrictive legal document. I kept my right hand trembling intentionally as I pressed the sharp metal nib directly to the crisp white paper. But I absolutely did not write my actual legal binding signature. I utilized a highly specific, heavily modified signature I had practiced perfectly over 50 times the night before in my dark apartment. It looked virtually identical at a quick, casual glance, but under basic professional legal scrutiny, it would be instantly classified as a complete, absolute forgery, making the entire restrictive, non-disclosure agreement completely null and void in any court of law. I slid the fully signed document across the polished desk toward my father. My parents exhaled a loud, simultaneous breath of massive tension leaving their bodies. They actually foolishly believed they had successfully buried their horrific federal crimes and identity theft forever. I kept my head bowed submissively and immediately moved to the next critical phase of the operation. I looked up at them with red, heavily swollen, tear-filled eyes and softly begged for a small, microscopic $2,000 personal loan. I told them I needed just enough cash to rent a cheap moving truck and relocate completely out of state to a small town in Oregon. I promised them with a breaking voice that they would never ever have to see my face again. I told them I was going to quietly disappear forever and start completely overworking at a basic entry-level retail job. The sheer overwhelming relief in the room was entirely palpable and deeply sickening. The prospect of the messy problem permanently removing itself across the country was incredibly appealing to their selfish natures. My father immediately pulled out his premium leather checkbook without a single moment of hesitation or remorse. He quickly wrote out a paper check for $2,000, acting as if he was performing a deeply generous act of profound fatherly charity, instead of returning a microscopic fraction of the massive wealth he had violently stolen from my bank account. As he handed me the crisp paper check, Sierra finally stood up from the velvet sofa. She walked slowly over to me, her expensive designer heels clicking sharply and loudly against the hardwood floor. She stopped inches from my face, completely invading my personal space. She looked me up and down with absolute profound disgust and superiority. She told me I was incredibly pathetic and totally useless. She laughed a cold, sharp sound right in my face and said I had always been nothing more than a boring corporate drone, completely lacking any real vision or genuine creative talent. She leaned in, dangerously close, whispering maliciously that it was entirely my own fault I lost absolutely everything because I was simply too weak and too stupid to protect what was legally mine. She told me to enjoy the rainy, miserable, depressing weather in Oregon while she officially took over the entire lucrative Chicago marketing industry using my stolen files. I stood perfectly still, forcing my entire body to absorb every single vile, cruel word without physically reacting. I clutched the $2,000 check incredibly tightly in my right fist, nodding subserviently to her abuse. I thanked my father, softly turned around, and walked slowly out of the grand house. I kept my head down until I was securely inside my locked car. The moment the heavy metal car doors shut, the pathetic broken facade entirely shattered into a million pieces. I looked down at the physical check in my hand, and a cold, completely ruthless smile spread rapidly across my face. I had successfully secured the exact seed money required to violently initiate their total federal destruction. I quickly deposited the funds via my secure mobile banking application and immediately wired the entire amount to Marcus so he could finalize the heavy retainer for our federal defense attorney. I started the engine, feeling an incredible, massive surge of pure electric adrenaline. Because they fully believed I was utterly defeated and permanently running away, they completely dropped their guard entirely. Their false sense of total, absolute security instantly catalyzed their most catastrophic, legally damning mistake yet. Just 10 minutes after I drove away from the wealthy suburban estate, my cell phone buzzed brightly on the dark dashboard. It was a highly encrypted text message from Marcus, who was actively monitoring Sierra's stolen digital financial accounts in real time from his secure location. He sent a single glowing screenshot that made my heart hammer violently against my ribs in pure, absolute triumph. Sierra, feeling absolutely invincible and completely untouchable after publicly humiliating me, had just recklessly logged into her main banking portal. She had successfully initiated a massive direct wire transfer of exactly $85,000 straight from the highly fraudulent federal business loan account directly into her personal checking account. The listed transaction memo read simply, Porsche down payment. She was aggressively, illegally moving stolen federal funds across state lines for personal luxury purchases, completely commingling the fraudulent money. She had just handed us the exact irrefutable proof of active wire fraud we desperately needed to legally trigger an immediate, devastating federal raid on her completely fake business. The $2,000 check from my father cleared my account precisely at 8 o'clock the next morning. It was the exact final puzzle piece we desperately needed to mobilize our aggressive legal strike team. I immediately wired the funds directly to Marcus, who combined it with his own hidden personal savings to officially secure the massive retainer for our chosen legal representation. We did not hire a standard civil litigator. We hired Harrison Knox, a terrifyingly ruthless federal defense attorney based in downtown Chicago, who specialized exclusively in high-level, white-collar crime and complex financial fraud. Harrison was a former federal prosecutor who knew exactly how the government built their criminal cases. When Marcus and I sat down in his sterile, heavily soundproofed office and handed him the encrypted flash drive containing the massive mountain of stolen digital evidence, Harrison did not blink. He plugged the drive into his secure offline computer and silently reviewed the fake loan applications, the forged signatures, and the highly illegal wire transfer Sierra had executed just hours prior. When he finally looked up, his eyes were completely devoid of warmth. He told us we had handed him a fully loaded smoking gun, but to completely guarantee my permanent legal immunity, we needed a certified forensic accountant to map the exact digital flow of every single stolen dollar. We hired a highly specialized financial auditor named Rachel, who spent the next 48 hours locked in a secure conference room, meticulously tearing Sierra's fake business completely apart. Rachel worked with absolute terrifying precision. She traced the initial $300,000 federal business loan directly back to its original government disbursement source. She systematically documented exactly how Sierra had utilized my stolen social security number and my pristine credit score to completely bypass the standard identity verification protocols. Rachel printed out massive sprawling visual flowcharts that physically mapped out the entire horrific criminal conspiracy. She highlighted the exact moment the stolen federal funds hit Sierra's primary business account, and then tracked every single reckless illegal transfer she made to fund her pathetic luxury lifestyle. She found the $85,000 wire transfer Sierra used to buy her brand new luxury vehicle. She found tens of thousands of dollars illegally funneled into offshore cosmetic surgery clinics and luxury vacation rentals. But most importantly, Rachel successfully linked the secondary $200,000 fraudulent commercial loan directly to my parents' personal bank accounts. She proved, without a single shadow of a doubt, that the money my father stole from my high-yield savings account was actively being used to temporarily, artificially inflate Sierra's debt ratio, to keep the federal investigators completely blind to the ongoing massive fraud. My parents were not just passive enablers. They were active high-level financial conspirators participating directly in a massive federal crime syndicate. While Rachel mapped the digital financial blood trail, Marcus utilized his massive industry influence and his elite investigative journalistic credentials to secure the final, highly crucial piece of physical evidence. He knew that digital signatures and network logs were incredibly powerful, but a sharp defense attorney could potentially argue that Sierra's computer had simply been hacked by an unknown third party. We needed absolute, undeniable physical proof that my parents were physically present and actively participating in the identity theft. Marcus drove directly to the specific suburban bank branch where the fraudulent commercial loan documents had been officially notarized. He walked into the busy lobby wearing his standard press credentials and asked to speak privately with the regional branch manager. Marcus had spent years cultivating deep, reliable sources within the Chicago banking industry while reporting on corporate corruption. He leveraged his powerful contacts to subtly convince the anxious branch manager that he was secretly investigating a massive regional mortgage fraud ring that was currently victimizing innocent local families. He requested highly restricted access to the branch security camera archives for the specific date and time stamped on the fraudulent notary documents. Because Marcus was a highly respected award-winning journalist, the manager actually complied, bypassing standard corporate security protocols to protect his branch from negative press exposure. Marcus sat in the dark security room and watched the grainy black and white footage roll backward until he found the exact moment. He copied the high-definition video file directly onto his secure encrypted drive. The footage clearly showed my mother and my father walking confidently into the bank lobby side by side with Sierra. It showed them sitting down at the massive mahogany desk of the branch notary public. It showed my father calmly pulling out his state-issued identification card and handing it directly to the bank employee. And then the camera perfectly captured the exact sickening moment my mother leaned forward, picked up a heavy black pen, and physically signed her name on the dotted line as a primary character witness and financial guarantor for a massive loan she absolutely knew was entirely fraudulent and taken out completely under my stolen identity. They were laughing and smiling in the video, completely relaxed, as they systematically signed my entire financial future and my legal freedom entirely away. Marcus brought the digital video file directly back to our attorney's secure downtown office. We projected the security footage onto the massive flat-screen television mounted on the conference room wall. I sat perfectly still, watching my own flesh and blood physically execute my complete destruction in high-definition black and white. It completely solidified the absolute cold, terrifying void where my heart used to be. Harrison Knox turned off the television and flipped on the bright overhead fluorescent lights. He looked at the sprawling forensic financial charts covering the massive conference table, and then he looked directly at me. He folded his hands precisely together and delivered the absolute harsh, terrifying reality of the American legal justice system. He explained that we possessed more than enough concrete evidence to file a massive civil lawsuit against Sierra and my parents. He said we could absolutely sue them for severe defamation, gross intellectual property theft, and massive financial damages. But he warned me very strictly that civil court was an incredibly slow, agonizing, and entirely bureaucratic nightmare. A standard civil lawsuit of this massive magnitude would take a minimum of 3 to 5 years to completely litigate. He explained that my wealthy father would immediately hire an army of highly aggressive corporate defense attorneys who would deliberately stall the legal proceedings, bury us in endless expensive paperwork, and systematically drain every single dollar of our limited legal fund until I was completely destitute and entirely forced to drop the case. Harrison stated flatly that if we chose the civil route, the massive fraudulent commercial loans taken out in my name would absolutely default long before we ever saw the inside of a courtroom. The federal government would immediately flag my social security number, and I would be the one violently arrested for federal wire fraud while we waited years for the civil trial to begin. Harrison leaned forward, placing both his hands flat on the polished mahogany table. He told me that to completely guarantee my absolute legal safety and to destroy them instantly, we could not rely on the slow-turning wheels of the civil justice system. We had to immediately force the hands of the highest federal authorities. We had to execute a completely undeniable, highly public exposure that physically cornered the criminals in real time, leaving the federal agents absolutely no choice but to act on the spot. Harrison explained that he had very close personal contacts within the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He said he could quietly hand them the entire forensic packet and the physical security footage today, but to ensure they actually mobilized an immediate tactical strike team instead of just opening a slow preliminary inquiry, we needed to serve the perpetrators up on a massive public silver platter. We needed an event so highly visible and so completely undeniable that my father could not possibly use his wealth or his influence to quiet the situation down. Marcus looked up from his notes, a slow, dark, calculating smile spreading across his face. He told the room that Sierra was currently utilizing her stolen federal loan money to throw a massive, highly publicized corporate launch gala for her brand new fake marketing agency this coming weekend. She had invited the local mayor, top industry executives, and dozens of high-profile members of the local press. It was the absolute perfect stage. Harrison agreed immediately. We were going to hijack her entire pristine reality. We were going to publicly execute the ultimate trap and let the federal government do the rest. The weekend arrived, bringing with it the absolute climax of Sierra's completely fabricated corporate empire. She had booked the grand ballroom at the most exclusive luxury hotel in downtown Chicago. It was a massive sprawling space completely covered in crystal chandeliers, imported white orchids, and incredibly expensive silk drapery. Every single detail of the opulent launch gala was meticulously designed to project an image of absolute infinite wealth and staggering industry success. Waiters, in crisp white tuxedos, carried silver trays completely loaded with premium vintage champagne and tiny decadent appetizers. A live classical string quartet played softly in the corner of the massive room, providing the perfect, elegant soundtrack to her incredibly toxic delusion. But standing in the shadows, I knew the absolute sickening truth behind the glamorous facade. Every single drop of champagne, every single delicate flower petal, and every single hour of the venue rental was completely funded by the massive, fraudulent federal business loans taken out under my stolen legal identity. Sierra was actively and recklessly burning through my completely destroyed financial future just to throw herself an incredibly lavish party. The guest list she had carefully curated was a massive testament to her terrifying delusions of grandeur. She had aggressively leveraged the stolen Zenith Media campaign portfolio to successfully invite the absolute most powerful elite figures in the entire city of Chicago. From my hidden vantage point, I watched the local city mayor walk through the heavy brass doors, smiling warmly for the flashing cameras of the local press. I saw dozens of highly influential tech industry executives mingling near the ice sculptures, completely unaware they were actively participating in a massive criminal fraud. And then my blood ran completely cold as I spotted a highly familiar face cutting through the crowded room. It was Julian, my former chief executive officer at Zenith Media. He was the exact man who had coldly fired me and entirely destroyed my professional reputation just 3 weeks ago. He was shaking hands and smiling brightly, completely fooled by Sierra's heavily doctored emails and my stolen creative assets. He was proudly attending the launch of what he foolishly believed was his brilliant new independent marketing consultant. The sheer staggering audacity of Sierra inviting my former boss to her fraudulent victory party was completely suffocating. She wanted to entirely replace me in every single aspect of my professional life. She wanted to stand on the absolute highest pedestal built entirely on my crushed bones. But Sierra had made one massive, catastrophic miscalculation. She was so entirely consumed by her own blinding narcissism that she completely failed to realize she was actively building her own public execution stage. Marcus and I had spent the previous 48 hours meticulously preparing our infiltration. We knew we could not simply walk through the front doors of the luxury hotel. We needed absolute total control over the entire environment to successfully execute our trap. Marcus utilized his deep, extensive network within the Chicago press corps to quietly discover exactly which third-party audio-visual production company Sierra had hired to run the technical aspects of the massive gala. He reached out to a trusted contact, a senior sound engineer who owed him a massive personal favor from a previous investigative journalism piece. Marcus explained the absolute gravity of the situation without revealing the specific federal crimes. He simply told the engineer that we needed immediate temporary access to the main control booth to publicly expose a massive corporate fraud in real time. The engineer, who deeply despised wealthy corporate thieves, completely agreed to look the other way for exactly 1 hour. Marcus and I arrived at the luxury downtown hotel 3 hours before the first guest even walked through the grand lobby doors. We completely abandoned our professional business attire. We dressed entirely in standard black production crew uniforms, complete with heavy black utility boots, dark matching baseball caps pulled low over our faces, and official laminated vendor security badges clipped directly to our shirts. We walked confidently through the bustling underground service tunnels, entirely bypassing the main hotel security checkpoints. We carried heavy black equipment cases containing our personal encrypted laptops and the massive digital payload of highly incriminating evidence. We rode the quiet freight elevator all the way up to the hidden catwalks located high above the grand ballroom. The main audiovisual control booth was a small, dark, enclosed room situated entirely out of sight from the wealthy guests below. It featured a massive glass observation window that provided a completely unobstructed panoramic view of the massive illuminated stage and the sprawling seating area. It was the absolute perfect sniper nest. We quietly entered the dark booth, and Marcus immediately locked the heavy metal door behind us, deadbolting it firmly from the inside. We systematically unpacked our equipment in absolute terrifying silence. Marcus plugged his laptop directly into the master digital projector interface, completely bypassing the standard hotel computer systems. I stood beside him, my hands completely steady, as I connected my encrypted flash drive to the main console. I rapidly loaded the massive high-definition files containing the highly fraudulent loan applications, the irrefutable banking wire transfers, and the damning bank security camera footage. I meticulously organized the digital evidence into a highly specific sequential presentation perfectly designed to completely obliterate Sierra's lies one by one. We tested the massive LED screens positioned directly behind the main stage, verifying that we had absolute total override control over the visual feed. We linked into the primary sound system, ensuring that when we finally cut the main microphone, the entire room would hear absolutely nothing but the crushing, devastating truth. Everything was perfectly flawless. The trap was completely set and entirely loaded. From the dark safety of the elevated control booth, I looked down through the heavy glass window and watched the massive room rapidly fill with Chicago elite. The vibrant, energetic hum of wealthy conversation echoed loudly up to the rafters. I watched my parents walk confidently to the very front row of the VIP seating area. My mother was wearing a completely brand new, extremely expensive designer evening gown, clearly purchased with my violently stolen emergency savings. My father looked incredibly proud, smiling broadly and shaking hands with the various corporate executives sitting nearby. They looked completely relaxed, entirely untouched by the massive catastrophic destruction they had so callously inflicted upon their own daughter. They genuinely believed I was currently driving a cheap rented moving truck across the miserable rainy plains of the Midwest, completely defeated and permanently broken. They had absolutely no idea that I was currently standing less than 50 feet above their heads, holding the absolute ultimate trigger to their total federal annihilation. And then the main ballroom lights slowly began to dim. A hush rapidly fell over the massive crowd of powerful attendees. A bright single spotlight suddenly illuminated the center of the grand stage. The soft classical music completely faded away, replaced by a highly energetic, modern electronic beat. Sierra walked out from behind the heavy velvet curtains, and the entire room erupted into massive enthusiastic applause. She was wearing a stunning, entirely custom-tailored white silk suit, radiating absolute fake confidence and stolen success. She walked directly to the clear acrylic podium, positioned at the very edge of the stage. She smiled brilliantly, waving directly at my parents, who were clapping loudly in the front row. She looked absolutely untouchable. She looked like a brilliant young visionary about to completely conquer the entire marketing world. I stood in the pitch-black control booth, my eyes locked entirely onto her glowing figure. I felt a massive surge of pure cold adrenaline completely flood my veins. I looked over at Marcus, who was standing perfectly still, his dark eyes completely focused on the master audio controls. He gave me a single, slow, deliberate nod. The countdown had officially reached 0. The elaborate glittering illusion was completely over. It was finally time to absolutely destroy them. I took a deep, steadying breath, allowing the absolute profound magnitude of the moment to wash entirely over me. Every single agonizing tear I had cried in my dark, empty apartment, every single terrifying moment of suffocating panic. When I saw my bank accounts completely drained, it all rapidly crystallized into a sharp, incredibly potent weapon. I placed my right hand firmly over the main digital execution switch on the control board. Below me, Sierra tapped the microphone lightly, sending a crisp, clear sound echoing across the massive, quiet room. She took a deep theatrical breath, preparing to deliver her highly rehearsed, completely fabricated origin story to the wealthy, gullible crowd. She was about to passionately tell them how she heroically overcame a deeply toxic family betrayal to build this incredible agency. She was about to publicly cement my absolute professional ruin to elevate her own status. The sheer, unadulterated evil of her plan was staggering, but I was no longer the helpless victim desperately begging for my parents' love and validation. I was the architect of their absolute inescapable downfall. I watched the local press reporters raise their professional cameras, focusing their bright flashing lenses directly onto the glowing stage. The federal agents we had meticulously coordinated with were already quietly moving into their designated positions, securing every single exit door in the entire building. There was absolutely nowhere left for them to run. The trap was fully sprung, and the terrifying fall was about to begin. I stood perfectly still in the pitch-black audio-visual control booth, positioned high above the grand ballroom of the Chicago luxury hotel. The sheer scale of the event was absolutely staggering. Hundreds of imported crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the massive crowd of the city elite. I looked through the thick soundproof glass window and watched the city mayor laughing with wealthy tech investors. I saw Julian, my former chief executive officer, sipping premium vintage champagne, completely oblivious to the fact that his presence was actively validating a massive federal crime. Every single decadent appetizer, every single silk tablecloth, and every single hour of the live classical string quartet was funded entirely by the fraudulent business loans taken out under my stolen identity. Sierra had spared absolutely no expense, burning through my financial future to build her ultimate pathetic delusion of grandeur. Marcus stood right beside me in the dark booth, his hands resting steadily on the master audio controls. He gave me a single silent nod. It was time. The massive ballroom lights slowly began to dim, signaling the beginning of the main presentation. A hushed, expectant silence rapidly fell over the 300 wealthy guests. A bright, blinding white spotlight suddenly illuminated the center of the grand stage. The classical music faded away, replaced by a highly energetic, modern electronic beat. Sierra confidently walked out from behind the heavy velvet curtains, and the entire room erupted into deafening applause. She looked absolutely radiant, wearing a custom-tailored white silk suit that screamed immaculate corporate success. She walked directly to the clear acrylic podium positioned at the very edge of the stage. She smiled brilliantly, waving directly at my parents, who were sitting in the premium front row VIP section. My mother was wearing a brand new designer evening gown, clearly purchased with my violently stolen emergency savings. My father looked incredibly proud, clapping loudly and beaming as if he had personally built this entirely fraudulent empire. They looked completely relaxed, entirely untouched by the massive catastrophic destruction they had so callously inflicted upon their eldest daughter. Sierra gently tapped the microphone, sending a crisp, clear sound echoing across the cavernous room. She took a deep theatrical breath and leaned directly into the podium. Her voice floated through the massive high-definition speakers, filling the silent room with a perfectly manufactured tone of profound, false humility. She started by gracefully thanking the mayor, the tech executives, and the various members of the Chicago Press Corps for attending her highly anticipated corporate launch. She deliberately made eye contact with Julian, thanking him publicly for recognizing her raw creative talent and for giving her the ultimate platform to showcase her independent vision. Julian nodded back at her, raising his glass in a silent toast of professional respect. Seeing the man who had coldly fired me, now publicly praising the sister who had violently stolen my entire life, sent a massive burning wave of pure absolute rage coursing through my veins. But I forced myself to watch every single agonizing second, because I knew it was the absolute final time she would ever stand on a public stage as a free woman. Then Sierra completely shifted the entire tone of her speech. She expertly lowered her voice, letting a slight manufactured tremor enter her words. She looked out at the massive crowd and told them that building this incredible marketing agency had not been an easy journey. She placed a hand elegantly over her heart and began weaving a completely fabricated, entirely malicious story about overcoming profound personal betrayal. She told the captivated room that the hardest part of achieving massive professional success was realizing that sometimes the people closest to you are the ones who want to see you fail the most. She explicitly brought up the concept of a deeply toxic, deeply jealous older sibling without saying my actual name. She painted a horrific, vivid picture of a sister who had actively tried to sabotage her rising career, steal her creative intellectual property, and threaten her into absolute silence. She actually squeezed her eyes tightly shut, forcing real physical tears to slowly trail down her perfectly contoured cheeks. She played the ultimate heartbreaking victim flawlessly. The sheer staggering audacity of her lies literally took my breath away. She was standing in front of the most powerful people in the city, explicitly accusing me of committing the exact devastating crimes that she had systematically perpetrated against me. I looked down at my parents in the front row. They were nodding solemnly along with her fabricated tragedy, completely validating her horrific lies with their physical presence. My father reached out and gently squeezed my mother's hand, presenting a united front of grieving but incredibly supportive parents who had bravely stood by their younger daughter through a vicious family ordeal. They were actively publicly co-signing my absolute professional and personal destruction without a single ounce of human remorse. The entire ballroom was completely captivated by her emotional performance. Several guests were visibly moved, shaking their heads in disgust at the imaginary toxic sister who had tried to ruin this brilliant young woman. Sierra wiped the carefully placed tears from her face and offered the crowd a brave, resilient smile. She passionately declared that her new agency was built entirely on a foundation of absolute transparency, radical honesty, and unbreakable ethical integrity. The massive hypocrisy of those specific words, echoing through a ballroom rented with stolen federal loan money, was absolutely staggering. The crowd erupted into massive, deafening applause. Julian stood up from his VIP table, initiating a full standing ovation. The mayor followed suit, and soon the entire grand ballroom was on its feet, cheering wildly. Sierra stood at the podium, soaking in the thunderous adoration, with her eyes closed and a massive victorious smile plastered across her face. She genuinely believed she had completely won. But right at the absolute peak of the deafening applause, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the grand ballroom quietly opened. Marcus stepped into the room wearing a sharp, dark tailored suit. He did not applaud. He did not smile. He walked with an incredibly slow, deliberate, and deeply terrifying purpose, straight down the main center aisle, directly toward the brightly lit stage. The audience members, nearest to the aisle, slowly stopped clapping and parted respectfully, completely recognizing him as the famous award-winning investigative journalist and the loving husband of the guest of honor. Sierra opened her eyes and spotted him immediately, her face completely lit up with what looked like genuine profound relief and absolute adoration. She visibly relaxed her shoulders, fully expecting her highly respected husband to be the absolute crowning jewel of her perfect fabricated evening. She leaned back into the microphone and excitedly announced to the massive crowd that her incredible supportive husband was coming up to the stage. She called him her ultimate rock and her absolute saving grace. My parents turned around in their front row seats and beamed proudly at Marcus as he walked past them. My father even gave him a subtle, encouraging nod, entirely oblivious to the absolute catastrophic destruction Marcus was carrying directly in his hands. Marcus did not look at them. He kept his dark, intense eyes locked entirely on his wife as he climbed the short flight of velvet-covered stairs and stepped directly onto the bright stage. Sierra reached out to embrace him completely, expecting a highly romantic public kiss, but Marcus did not open his arms to hold her. He walked right past her outstretched hands and stepped directly up to the clear acrylic podium. He gently but firmly took the microphone completely out of her grasp. Sierra looked slightly confused for a brief fleeting second, but she quickly recovered, plastering her perfect supportive smile back onto her face. She stepped slightly to the side, allowing him to take the absolute center stage. The massive crowd slowly hushed to a complete silent standstill, eagerly anticipating a highly emotional speech. Marcus stood perfectly still at the podium, looking out over the sea of wealthy, powerful faces. He let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out for 10 agonizing seconds, completely commanding the entire room with his sheer physical presence. When he finally spoke, his voice was completely devoid of any warmth or affection. It was the cold, sharp, unyielding voice of a seasoned investigative reporter, completely exposing a deeply corrupt politician. He stated clearly and loudly into the microphone that his name was Marcus Hayes, and he had spent his entire professional career systematically hunting down and completely destroying massive corporate frauds. He paused, letting those specific heavy words echo loudly. Sierra slightly shifted her weight, her perfect smile faltering just a fraction of an inch. She softly whispered his name, leaning slightly toward the microphone, but Marcus completely ignored her. He looked directly down at my parents, sitting in the very front row, and then he looked straight at Julian. Marcus took a deep breath and delivered the absolute devastating opening blow. He announced to the entire silent ballroom that he was officially and publicly filing for an immediate, irrevocable divorce from his wife Sierra, effective right this exact second. The collective gasp that violently ripped through the grand ballroom was absolutely deafening. 300 wealthy guests completely recoiled in absolute sheer shock. Julian dropped his expensive champagne glass, letting it shatter violently against the polished hardwood floor. My mother physically gasped, bringing both her hands rapidly up to cover her mouth in pure, terrified horror. My father shot up from his velvet chair, his face instantly turning a dangerous dark shade of crimson. Sierra stood completely frozen on the brightly lit stage, her perfectly contoured face draining entirely of all blood, leaving her looking like a terrified, hollow ghost. Marcus leaned entirely back into the microphone, his voice booming with absolute terrifying authority. He told the horrified audience that every single word Sierra had just spoken to them was a complete, absolute fabricated lie. He raised his hand, pointing directly toward the dark ceiling, specifically toward the elevated audio-visual control booth where I was standing. He told the entire room that it was finally time to meet the absolute real brains behind the stolen campaign, the actual victim of this horrific family conspiracy, and the true rightful owner of the entire marketing empire. He clearly and loudly spoke my full name into the microphone, forcefully calling me to completely step out of the dark and finish the absolute destruction of their entire lives. I pushed open the heavy metal door of the audio-visual control booth and stepped out onto the narrow elevated catwalk. The sheer height gave me a terrifying panoramic view of the completely paralyzed crowd below. I walked down the metal spiral staircase, my heavy black production boots clanging loudly against the steel steps. The sound echoed like a judge slamming a heavy wooden gavel in a dead silent courtroom. I reached the ground floor and pushed through the heavy velvet curtains at the back of the grand ballroom. The entire sea of wealthy, powerful guests turned their heads simultaneously to look directly at me. I was not wearing a custom-tailored silk suit or an expensive designer evening gown. I was wearing a plain black production crew uniform with a standard vendor badge clipped to my chest. But as I walked straight down the main center aisle, I felt absolutely 10 feet tall. I felt like an unstoppable force of pure absolute justice, rapidly descending upon a fragile, entirely fabricated house of cards. Two massive hotel security guards, wearing dark tailored suits, immediately stepped directly into my path, attempting to physically block me from reaching the stage. They reached out their thick hands to grab my shoulders, but before they could even make physical contact, Marcus leaned directly into the microphone. His voice thundered across the massive room, commanding the guards to step back immediately. He stated clearly and with absolute terrifying authority that I was the primary victim of a massive active federal crime and that they were currently standing directly in the way of a live federal investigation. The security guards completely froze, exchanging panicked, uncertain glances before slowly stepping aside and lowering their hands. I walked right past them without breaking my steady stride, my eyes locked entirely on the terrified, pale face of my younger sister. Sierra was physically trembling now, her perfect, confident posture completely collapsing under the crushing, undeniable weight of her immediate public exposure. I reached the bottom of the velvet-covered stairs and climbed them slowly, deliberately, stepping right into the blinding white spotlight alongside Marcus. Sierra violently flinched backward, as if my physical presence was actively burning her skin. I did not even look at her. I turned my back to her and faced the massive crowd of 300 shocked corporate executives and local politicians. I looked directly at Julian, my former chief executive officer, who was still standing completely frozen by his premium VIP table. I looked down at my parents, who were gripping the armrests of their front row seats, their faces contorted into masks of absolute sheer terror. I reached out, and Marcus handed me the microphone. My hand was completely steady, and my voice did not shake even a fraction of an inch. I spoke clearly and loudly, telling the entire silent room that my name was Harper Thompson, and the woman trembling violently behind me had not simply stolen my creative marketing campaign, but had systematically stolen my entire legal identity to secretly fund this pathetic, glamorous illusion. I turned slightly and gave Marcus a single sharp nod. He immediately pressed the main execution switch on the master control board he had brought down to the podium. The massive, incredibly expensive high-definition LED screens positioned directly behind the main stage instantly flickered and violently changed. The elegant, glowing logo of Sierra's completely fake agency was instantly vaporized from existence. In its place, a massive, sprawling, highly detailed forensic financial flowchart filled the entire massive wall. It was a completely undeniable visual map of her staggering multi-level federal wire fraud. I pointed directly at the massive screen and began narrating the absolute total destruction of her lies. I walked the horrified crowd through every single highly illegal transaction with the cold clinical precision of a seasoned federal prosecutor. The massive screen rapidly flashed high-definition digital images of the fraudulent federal business loan applications, displaying my exact stolen name, my stolen home address, and my highly confidential social security number printed clearly in bold black ink. I told the completely silent room that while Sierra was busy spinning a heartbreaking fabricated tale of overcoming a toxic sibling, she was actively utilizing my pristine credit history to illegally secure over $300,000 in government-funded commercial loans. The crowd gasped loudly as the screen instantly switched to display the exact banking wire transfers, proving she had illegally commingled the stolen federal funds directly into her personal checking account. I showed them the exact $85,000 transaction she used to purchase her brand new luxury Porsche. I showed them the tens of thousands of dollars she aggressively funneled into expensive offshore cosmetic clinics and luxury vacation rentals. I watched the local press reporters furiously typing on their digital tablets, their bright camera flashes completely blinding, as they rapidly documented the biggest corporate financial scandal of the decade right in real time. Sierra let out a loud, pathetic whimpering sound directly behind me. She sank slowly to her knees right there on the bright stage, bearing her perfectly contoured face in her trembling hands. Her beautiful white silk suit suddenly looked like a cheap, pathetic Halloween costume. But I was not even close to being finished with her or the people who enabled her. I told the massive crowd that a fraud of this staggering financial magnitude could never be executed by just one single incompetent person. I stated clearly and loudly that Sierra had massive high-level financial help from the exact same people who were currently sitting in the very front row violently pretending to be innocent, supportive parents. I pointed my finger directly down at my mother and my father. The entire grand ballroom collectively turned their heads to stare directly at them. My father aggressively shook his head, his face a terrifying mixture of absolute panic and violent defensive rage. He opened his mouth to shout something, but I completely cut him off. I gave Marcus another sharp nod, and the massive LED screens behind me instantly shifted again. This time, it was not a static digital banking document. It was a high-definition black and white video file. It was the exact security camera footage Marcus had expertly extracted from the suburban bank branch. The video played on a massive continuous loop dominating the entire grand ballroom. The 300 wealthy guests watched in absolute complete horrified silence as the crystal-clear footage showed my parents confidently walking into the bank lobby right alongside Sierra. The camera perfectly captured my father calmly pulling out his state-issued identification card and handing it directly to the bank notary. And then the absolute undeniable climax played out on the massive 50-foot screen. The video clearly showed my mother leaning forward, picking up a heavy black pen and physically signing her exact legal name as the primary financial guarantor for a massive $200,000 fraudulent commercial loan taken out entirely under my violently stolen identity. They were completely caught in high-definition black and white, actively participating in a massive federal conspiracy to permanently destroy their eldest daughter's life. The reaction from the wealthy crowd was absolutely instantaneous and entirely catastrophic. The elite of Chicago are incredibly protective of their own pristine public reputations, and they realized with absolute terrifying clarity that they were currently attending a massive party funded entirely by stolen federal money. The room erupted into absolute chaotic pandemonium. Several high-profile tech executives immediately stood up from their tables, grabbing their coats and rushing frantically toward the main exit doors, desperately trying to distance themselves from the radioactive legal fallout. The local city mayor looked completely sick to his stomach, violently whispering to his private security detail to get him out of the room immediately. The press reporters completely abandoned their assigned seats, rushing directly toward the edge of the stage, shouting aggressive questions over the deafening noise. The pristine, glamorous corporate launch gala had completely, instantly devolved into an absolute terrifying public nightmare. My parents finally completely snapped. The absolute sheer terror of being publicly exposed as federal criminals in front of their wealthy, influential peers completely shattered their arrogant suburban facade. My mother let out a loud, piercing, hysterical scream. She jumped up from her velvet chair, completely ignoring the heavy, expensive designer gown she was wearing. My father lunged forward, his face completely purple, with absolute blinding rage. They violently pushed past the terrified guests sitting next to them and aggressively rushed the brightly lit stage. My father scrambled up the velvet stairs, pointing a shaking, furious finger directly at my face. He screamed at the absolute top of his lungs that I was completely insane and deeply mentally unstable. He shouted desperately to the panicking crowd that the video playing behind me was entirely faked and that it was a malicious digital fabrication generated by a jealous, vindictive daughter trying to ruin her highly successful younger sister. My mother clawed her way up onto the stage right behind him, crying hysterically and violently, grabbing at my arms, trying to physically rip the microphone right out of my hands. She screamed that I was a complete pathological liar and that I needed immediate locked psychiatric hospitalization. I did not back away from them, even a single inch. I stood my ground, completely planting my heavy boots firmly onto the stage floor. I looked directly into my father's terrified, desperate eyes and spoke directly into the microphone, amplifying my calm, steady voice completely over his violent screaming. I told him that screaming fake news was not going to save him from a massive federal indictment. I told him the digital network data logs were currently broadcasting directly onto the massive screens behind us, completely proving that Sierra had hacked my corporate laptop from his exact home network, utilizing his highly secure personal internet router. The massive LED screens instantly flashed, the undeniable digital footprints directly linking the stolen Zenith media marketing campaign to their pristine suburban house. The absolute sheer overwhelming volume of irrefutable forensic evidence completely buried their desperate, pathetic lies. There was absolutely no narrative left for them to spin, and no powerful context left to save them. They were completely violently trapped under the crushing, undeniable weight of their own horrific actions. Down in the chaotic, frantic mess of the audience, Julian, my former chief executive officer, finally completely understood the absolute catastrophic mistake he had made. He had been standing completely frozen near the front of the stage, watching the forensic evidence utterly annihilate the woman he had just publicly praised. When the digital logs flashed onto the massive screen proving Sierra had stolen my exact $50 million tech campaign, Julian physically staggered backward as if he had been violently punched directly in the chest. He looked up at me standing strong and completely unbroken on the stage, and the absolute profound realization violently washed over his pale face. He realized with absolute sickening clarity that he had been completely played for an absolute fool. He had blindly believed a fraudulent, failing lifestyle blogger over his own highly dedicated, completely flawless senior marketing director. He had aggressively fired his absolute best employee entirely based on a massive, highly orchestrated family lie. And he had just publicly attached his massive corporate agency to a rapidly sinking federal crime syndicate. Julian aggressively pushed his way through the panicking crowd, completely ignoring the chaotic reporters and the fleeing local politicians. He marched directly to the very edge of the stage, looking up at me with eyes full of absolute profound regret and sheer absolute panic. He shouted my name over the deafening noise of my parents' hysterical screaming. He desperately begged me to come down from the stage to speak with him privately in the hotel lobby right that second. He promised loudly that he would immediately completely reinstate my senior position with a massive pay increase. He swore he would aggressively issue a massive public retraction of the devastating press release that had completely ruined my industry reputation. He was entirely desperate to save his own corporate skin from the massive impending legal fallout of wrongfully terminating an innocent, highly valuable employee based on completely fraudulent, fabricated evidence. I looked down at Julian, grasping desperately at the edge of the stage like a drowning man. I looked at my mother, who was now collapsed entirely on the floor next to Sierra, violently sobbing into her expensive stolen gown, unable to even look me in the eye. I looked at my father, who was standing completely paralyzed, his hands shaking violently as he finally realized his massive wealth and his arrogant influence could absolutely not save him from the undeniable digital evidence currently broadcasting to the entire city. I held the microphone tightly in my hand, feeling a massive, overwhelming surge of absolute total victory completely flood my entire soul. I did not need Julian's desperate, pathetic job offer. I did not need my parents' fake conditional love. I had completely, systematically dismantled the entire toxic structure that had suffocated me for my entire adult life. I had successfully, completely burned their fraudulent empire straight down to its absolute foundation. I turned slightly, looking toward the heavy brass doors at the very back of the grand ballroom, fully anticipating the absolute final devastating blow. The elaborate, inescapable trap had been flawlessly executed, and the absolute ultimate authorities were finally completely ready to clean up the catastrophic wreckage. Sierra realized the digital evidence currently broadcasting on the massive high-definition screens behind us was completely insurmountable. The crushing weight of her inescapable reality finally snapped whatever fragile thread of sanity she had left holding her fake empire together. She scrambled violently up from the stage floor, her incredibly expensive custom white silk suit completely ruined and heavily stained with her own panicked tears and smeared makeup. She looked wildly out at the chaotic grand ballroom, searching desperately for any possible way out of the absolute nightmare she had built for herself. She lunged frantically toward the heavy velvet curtains positioned at their far right side of the brightly lit stage, hoping to completely disappear through the dark backstage service corridors. Her designer heel slipped violently on the polished acrylic floor, causing her to stumble and crash heavily forward. She kicked the expensive shoes off, completely abandoning them on the stage, and ran frantically in her bare feet. The local press reporters instantly swarmed the very edge of the stage, pointing their massive camera lenses directly at her fleeing figure. The bright white flashes of their professional cameras illuminated her absolute panic, creating a terrifying continuous strobe effect across the darkened ballroom. She looked exactly like a cornered animal, desperately trying to claw her way out of a burning cage. She reached the heavy fabric of the velvet curtain and pulled it back violently, only to find her path entirely permanently blocked. Marcus did not even try to physically chase her. He stood perfectly still at the center of the stage, holding the microphone with an incredibly steady hand. He watched her pathetic, frantic attempt to completely flee the consequences of her horrific crimes with absolute cold indifference. He raised the microphone directly back to his mouth, and his deep, booming voice echoed powerfully over the chaotic shouting of the massive, wealthy crowd. He told Sierra to stop running immediately because there was absolutely nowhere left in the entire world for her to hide. He announced to the entirely panicked ballroom that he and my highly specialized defense attorney had not just prepared a devastating visual presentation for the evening. They had actively spent the last 48 hours in direct, constant communication with the highest executive levels of federal law enforcement. He looked directly at Sierra, who was currently frozen completely still by the backstage curtain, breathing heavily and clutching the heavy velvet fabric with violently shaking hands. Marcus told her he had invited some very special guests to her lavish corporate launch gala. He pointed his finger directly toward the massive, heavy brass doors located at the very back of the grand ballroom. The entire sea of wealthy corporate executives and terrified local politicians turned their heads simultaneously to look. The heavy brass doors violently swung open, hitting the surrounding walls with a massive, deafening thud that shook the floor. A team of 12 highly trained federal agents, wearing dark tactical windbreakers, marched directly into the room. The sheer imposing physical presence of the federal law enforcement team instantly silenced the chaotic screaming of the wealthy elite crowd. The agents moved with absolute terrifying military precision, completely ignoring the frantic corporate executives as they marched directly down the main center aisle. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with cold steel gray eyes, walked straight up the velvet-covered stairs and stepped heavily onto the bright stage. He did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. He walked directly over to Sierra, who was now backed entirely against the hard wall, completely trapped by the heavy curtains and the advancing federal team. She held her shaking hands up in front of her face, violently sobbing and desperately begging him to just listen to her for 1 minute. She frantically tried to tell the agent that this was all a massive, terrible misunderstanding and that her vindictive older sister was maliciously framing her. The lead federal agent completely ignored her pathetic, entirely fabricated lies. He grabbed her left arm firmly, spinning her roughly around and forcefully pressing her directly against the hard stage wall. He pulled a pair of heavy, cold steel handcuffs from his tactical belt, and the loud, sharp clicking sound of the metal locking tightly around her thin wrists echoed clearly across the dead silent ballroom. He read her Miranda rights in a loud, booming authoritative voice, officially charging her with massive federal wire fraud, severe identity theft, and high-level criminal conspiracy. The press reporters completely lost their minds, rapidly snapping hundreds of high-definition photographs of the brilliant young entrepreneur being violently handcuffed on the exact same stage she had aggressively rented with stolen federal money. Sierra completely collapsed under the absolute physical weight of the massive federal arrest, her knees buckling entirely as 2 additional agents grabbed her arms to physically hold her up. Her perfect, glamorous corporate launch had officially permanently become her absolute ultimate public execution. But the highly trained federal agents were absolutely not finished. The lead agent left Sierra in the strict custody of his team and walked directly down the short flight of stage stairs toward the premium VIP seating area. My parents were standing completely frozen next to their incredibly expensive velvet chairs. My mother was shaking so violently, she looked like she was standing directly in the freezing snow without a coat. My father had his trembling hands raised defensively in the air, completely terrified by the sudden, overwhelming physical presence of federal law enforcement. He desperately tried to utilize his massive, wealthy suburban arrogance one absolute final time. He puffed out his chest and loudly demanded to speak directly to the commanding officer of the entire federal division. He falsely and aggressively claimed that he was a highly respected retired banking executive and that he possessed incredibly powerful political connections throughout the entire state of Illinois. He actually threatened to have the federal agent immediately fired for severely embarrassing his wealthy, pristine family in front of the city mayor. The lead agent did not even blink at the pathetic, hollow threat. He walked right up to my father, pulling a second heavy pair of steel handcuffs directly from his dark belt. He looked my father dead in the terrified eyes and coldly informed him that the federal government absolutely does not care about his exclusive suburban country club memberships or his entirely corrupt local banking connections. He told my father they had already completely secured the high-definition banking security footage of him actively committing massive federal bank fraud. The agent grabbed my father's arms violently, twisting them forcefully behind his back and tightly locking the cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. My father let out a loud, pathetic gasping sound, his entirely fabricated, arrogant facade completely crumbling into absolute sheer blinding terror. The loud metallic click of the handcuffs finalizing his absolute arrest was the most beautiful, incredible sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Another federal agent immediately stepped aggressively toward my mother. She completely lost whatever tiny, fragile fragment of sanity she still possessed. She began screaming hysterically, thrashing her arms wildly in the air, trying to forcefully, physically fight off the highly trained federal officer. She completely ruined her incredibly expensive stolen designer evening gown as she violently dropped to the polished hardwood floor, desperately trying to crawl away from the arresting agent. It was an absolutely pathetic, horrifying public display of complete moral bankruptcy. The agent easily apprehended her, pulling her forcefully back to her feet and firmly locking her hands securely behind her back. She sobbed uncontrollably, her carefully applied expensive makeup completely running down her pale face in dark, ugly streaks. She looked completely, utterly unrecognizable. She was no longer the pristine, wealthy suburban matriarch who hosted elegant garden parties and looked down on everyone around her. She was an exposed, terrifying federal criminal, completely stripped of her immense stolen wealth, her powerful social status, and her absolute toxic control over my life. The three of them, my father, my mother, and my younger sister, were now completely physically restrained, securely surrounded by a massive, unyielding wall of federal law enforcement officers, while hundreds of their wealthy peers watched in absolute stunned, horrified silence. I stood perfectly still at the center of the brightly lit stage, watching the entire catastrophic scene unfold directly below me. I felt a massive, profound sense of absolute peace completely wash over my soul. Every single late night I had spent working myself to the bone to build my corporate career, every single dollar I had carefully saved to secure my financial independence, and every single agonizing tear I had shed when they violently betrayed me had all completely led directly to this exact magnificent moment of pure, absolute justice. I looked out at the massive sea of wealthy guests. The elite corporate executives and the local politicians were completely entirely silent. They were staring at my family with expressions of absolute profound disgust and sheer unadulterated horror. They realized they had been completely manipulated into attending a massive celebration funded entirely by horrific criminal identity theft. Julian, my former chief executive officer, was standing completely paralyzed near the front row, watching the exact people who had violently lied to him get forcefully dragged away in federal handcuffs. He looked absolutely sick to his stomach, entirely realizing the massive, catastrophic professional mistake he had made by blindly trusting their fabricated evidence over my 8 years of completely flawless corporate loyalty. The federal agents began to physically move their terrified prisoners toward the main center aisle, preparing to march them directly out of the grand ballroom and into the massive armored federal transport vehicles currently waiting right outside the hotel lobby. Sierra was crying so hysterically she could not even physically walk. 2 strong federal agents had to violently drag her across the polished floor, her bare feet dragging uselessly behind her. My father walked with his head completely bowed, entirely unable to look his wealthy corporate peers in the eye, as he was paraded past them exactly like a common street criminal. But as the federal agents forcefully marched my mother past the very edge of the brightly lit stage, she suddenly, violently stopped. She aggressively dug her expensive heels directly into the hardwood floor, refusing to move another single inch toward the exit. She twisted her handcuffed body violently around and looked directly up at me. Her face was completely soaked with heavy dark tears, and her eyes were wide with absolute sheer blinding terror. She screamed my name at the absolute top of her lungs, her voice completely cracking and echoing violently across the dead silent ballroom. She desperately begged me to immediately tell the federal agents to stop. She loudly pleaded with me, completely ignoring the hundreds of flashing press cameras surrounding her. She cried out that I had to completely drop all the criminal charges right this exact second. She desperately reminded me of all the years they had provided a roof over my head and all the supposed financial sacrifices they had made for my education. She violently threw the absolute ultimate toxic weapon they had used to control me my entire adult life directly at my feet. She screamed, "Harper, please stop this. We are your family." Her desperate, pathetic words hung heavily in the dead, silent air, completely amplifying the absolute sheer magnitude of her profound toxic delusion. She actually genuinely believed that after completely destroying my career, violently stealing my life savings, actively forging my signature on massive federal loans, and trying to permanently send me to federal prison, she could still somehow manipulate me with the completely hollow concept of unconditional family loyalty. I looked down at her completely broken, handcuffed form. I did not feel a single ounce of sadness. I did not feel a single drop of pity or human remorse. The desperate, heartbroken daughter who used to constantly beg for their approval was completely permanently dead. I stepped directly to the very edge of the stage, looking down at her from my elevated position. I leaned forward and spoke entirely without a microphone, but my voice was so incredibly cold and incredibly sharp that it completely pierced through the entire silent room. I looked directly into her terrified eyes and told her that family does not systematically steal an entire life savings. I told her that family does not maliciously destroy a pristine corporate career to cover up a massive failure. I looked at my father, who was now desperately staring up at me, and I looked at Sierra, who was violently sobbing in the arms of the federal agents. I stood up perfectly straight, completely reclaiming every single ounce of my stolen power. I told them with absolute terrifying finality that family absolutely does not forge signatures on massive federal bank loans. I stared completely dead into my mother's horrified eyes and delivered the absolute final devastating blow. Enjoy federal prison. My words hit her exactly like a massive physical strike. Her entire body violently recoiled, completely collapsing under the absolute undeniable reality that her toxic reign of terror was entirely permanently over. The federal agents did not give her another single second to speak. They violently yanked her aggressively forward, forcing her to march directly down the long center aisle, right alongside her completely destroyed husband and her entirely ruined golden child. The massive heavy brass doors of the grand ballroom swung violently shut behind them, completely sealing their horrific, terrifying fate forever. I stood on the brightly lit stage right next to Marcus, completely surrounded by the blinding flashes of the local press corps. The massive LED screens behind me were still actively broadcasting the undeniable forensic proof of my absolute innocence. I had completely lost everything I ever cared about in a single afternoon, but I had violently clawed my way back from absolute total destruction to completely annihilate the monsters hiding in my own home. The absolute loudest sound in the massive grand ballroom was the heavy echoing silence of a completely victorious, entirely reborn survivor. 6 months is exactly how long it takes for the heavy, unyielding wheels of the federal justice system to completely grind an arrogant, fraudulent empire into fine, useless dust. The immediate catastrophic fallout from the corporate launch gala was completely absolute and entirely devastating. The local Chicago press aggressively ran the explosive story for weeks, completely plastering Sierra's tear-stained, terrified face across the front pages of every major newspaper and business blog in the entire state. The federal prosecutors did not offer her a single microscopic ounce of leniency or legal mercy. because the financial fraud involved massive amounts of government-funded commercial loans and severe intentional malicious identity theft. The white-collar crime division aggressively pursued the absolute maximum penalty available under federal law. Sierra sat in the cold, sterile federal courtroom wearing a standard oversized orange prison jumpsuit, looking entirely stripped of her fake glamorous armor. There were absolutely no custom-tailored white silk suits and no expensive designer makeup left to hide her profound pathetic reality. She wept uncontrollably as the federal judge violently slammed his heavy wooden gavel and officially sentenced her to 5 solid years in a strict minimum security federal penitentiary. 5 agonizing years of waking up on a thin, hard metal cot, completely stripped of her stolen wealth and her highly fabricated identity. Marcus had successfully finalized their divorce proceedings within the very first month, leaving her completely isolated, entirely alone, and completely legally destitute. She was no longer the golden child or the brilliant young entrepreneur she had pretended to be. She was just another convicted federal inmate, securely locked away from the wealthy elite society she had tried so desperately to manipulate and deceive. My parents experienced an entirely different but equally agonizing form of absolute total destruction. They managed to narrowly avoid serving actual physical prison time by completely cooperating with the aggressive federal authorities and forcefully testifying directly against their own daughter in open federal court. The sheer profound irony of them violently turning on their precious golden child just to save their own pathetic skin was absolutely staggering. But their highly conditional freedom came with an incredibly massive catastrophic financial price tag. The federal judge aggressively ordered them to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in absolute total financial restitution to the defrauded banking institutions, and directly to me for the severe emotional and financial damages they had maliciously inflicted. To satisfy the massive federal mandate, and to afford their own highly expensive team of desperate defense attorneys, they were forcefully compelled to completely permanently liquidate their entire pristine suburban lifestyle. The sprawling, luxurious mansion in Oak Brook, with its manicured green lawns and its heavy oak doors, was aggressively foreclosed upon and quickly sold at a massive public auction. The expensive luxury vehicles, the exclusive country club memberships, and the imported designer wardrobes were all entirely completely repossessed by angry debt collectors. The exact same people who had callously told me to just move away to Oregon and work a basic retail job were now actively forced to relocate into a tiny, cramped, 2-bedroom apartment situated in a highly undesirable, dangerous neighborhood on the far outskirts of the city. Their wealthy elite friends completely permanently abandoned them, entirely refusing to be socially associated with confessed federal accomplices. My mother attempted to call me several times, leaving desperate sobbing voicemails begging for my forgiveness and asking for financial help to buy basic groceries. I completely ignored every single call and permanently blocked their numbers. They had actively chosen to completely destroy their eldest daughter to protect their fake public image. And in the absolute end, they completely lost absolutely everything they had spent their entire selfish lives desperately trying to build. While they were busy violently collapsing under the immense crushing weight of their own terrifying legal consequences, I was actively aggressively rebuilding my entire life from the absolute ground up. The massive industry blacklist that had completely suffocated my career just 6 months ago was entirely completely vaporized the exact second the federal indictments were officially unsealed and broadcasted to the public. My professional reputation was not just entirely restored, it was completely exponentially elevated to a legendary status. I was no longer just a brilliant senior marketing director, I was the incredibly resilient, brilliant executive who had successfully single-handedly taken down a massive, highly sophisticated corporate fraud ring. My personal cell phone constantly rang with massive, lucrative job offers from every single major creative agency in the entire Midwest. But the absolute most satisfying phone call I received came directly from Julian, my former chief executive officer at Zenith Media. He desperately pleaded with me to meet him for a private corporate lunch at the most expensive exclusive steakhouse in downtown Chicago. I agreed to meet him purely to visually witness his absolute pathetic desperation in person. He sat across from me in a private leather booth, looking incredibly nervous and deeply, profoundly remorseful. His agency had completely hemorrhaged massive clients ever since the massive public scandal, heavily associating their brand with federal criminals. He completely bypassed the standard corporate small talk and immediately pushed a thick, heavy official contract directly across the polished wooden table. He looked me dead in the eye and aggressively formally begged me to return to Zenith Media. He told me the agency was currently completely floundering without my specific creative vision and my intense strategic leadership. He offered me a massive promotion to the official position of Executive Vice President of Marketing, completely bypassing 3 entire levels of corporate seniority. He offered me an absolutely staggering 7-figure base salary, a massive unconditional signing bonus, and a complete written public apology actively published in every major industry trade magazine. Julian sat back in the expensive leather booth, completely holding his breath, absolutely entirely convinced that his massive financial offering would instantly secure my absolute immediate return to his corporate empire. He honestly, foolishly thought he could just easily buy back my unwavering loyalty with a massive corporate title and a heavy corporate paycheck. I sat perfectly still, looking down at the incredibly lucrative contract resting heavily on the polished wooden table. 6 months ago, I would have completely enthusiastically given absolutely anything to have this exact incredible career opportunity. I would have blindly signed the heavy corporate contract without a single moment of hesitation just to feel secure again. But the terrified, desperate woman who used to eagerly seek external corporate validation was completely, entirely dead. I looked slowly up at Julian and smiled a cold, sharp, completely unyielding smile. I gently pushed the thick, heavy contract straight back across the table, completely rejecting his massive, desperate offer without a single ounce of regret. I told him very clearly and calmly that I entirely appreciated his profound, belated realization of my massive professional worth, but I absolutely was not returning to Zenith Media ever again. Julian looked completely physically shocked, his jaw actually dropping slightly as he desperately asked me why I would ever walk away from such an unprecedented, massive sum of guaranteed corporate money. I leaned forward, resting my arms directly on the table, and told him that I absolutely did not need his corporate money anymore. I explained to him that as the primary legal victim of a massive high-level federal financial fraud, I had recently received complete total financial restitution directly from the violently liquidated assets of my former parents and the completely seized bank accounts of my convicted sister. I told him I had taken that massive absolute financial windfall and successfully utilized every single stolen dollar to officially entirely fund the creation of my very own elite independent marketing firm. I watched the absolute terrifying realization completely wash over his pale face as he finally entirely understood the massive gravity of my words. I was no longer his desperate fired employee, desperately seeking a corporate lifeline. I was now actively his most dangerous, powerful, direct industry competitor, fully armed with massive financial backing, a completely flawless public reputation, and an absolute ruthless determination to completely dominate the entire Chicago market. The view from the 42nd floor of my brand new corner office was absolutely breathtaking. I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, looking out over the sprawling, vibrant skyline of downtown Chicago. Just 6 months ago, I was sitting in my dark, freezing apartment, terrified of an imminent eviction notice, and completely paralyzed by the sudden violent theft of my entire life savings. Today, I was the sole owner and primary chief executive officer of Vanguard Strategic Insights, the fastest growing and most aggressively successful independent marketing firm in the entire Midwest. We had not just simply entered the highly competitive corporate market, we had completely, utterly dominated it. The massive, highly publicized downfall of Zenith Media and the absolute federal destruction of Sierra's fraudulent agency had left a massive power vacuum in the industry, and I had immediately stepped right in to fill it. My client roster was currently overflowing with massive multi-million-dollar national accounts. I had successfully hired away the absolute best creative directors, top-tier graphic designers, and brilliant financial strategists from every major rival firm in the city. The physical office space behind me was a beautiful testament to absolute authentic success. It was filled with natural sunlight, thriving green plants, and the highly energetic hum of dozens of brilliant professionals actively collaborating. There were absolutely no fake imported chandeliers and no stolen ideas. Every single inch of this massive corporate empire was built entirely on my own raw talent, my relentless, unbreakable work ethic, and the massive financial restitution I had legally ripped right back from the greedy hands of my toxic family. The heavy glass door to my expansive office clicked open, and Marcus walked confidently into the room. He was wearing a sharp-tailored charcoal suit and carrying two delicate crystal glasses in his hands. Marcus was not just my trusted ally and the brilliant man who helped me completely expose my horrific family. He was officially the very first major executive hire I had made when I opened the doors to this firm. I had aggressively recruited him away from the Chicago Tribune, offering him the highly specialized position of head of public relations and investigative strategy. It was an absolutely brilliant, unmatched corporate partnership. Marcus utilized his deep, extensive background in elite investigative journalism to aggressively vet every single potential client, completely ensuring our agency only ever partnered with highly ethical, transparent corporations. He possessed a terrifyingly sharp ability to completely anticipate and utterly neutralize any potential negative public relations crises long before they ever reached the media. Together, we were a completely unstoppable, devastatingly effective corporate powerhouse. We had taken the absolute worst betrayal of our entire lives and aggressively, alchemically transformed it into massive, undeniable professional victory. Marcus walked over to my massive polished oak desk and set the two crystal glasses down right next to a chilled bottle of premium vintage champagne. This was not the cheap, heavily subsidized liquor Sierra had recklessly purchased with stolen federal money. This was the authentic, undeniable taste of genuine, hard-earned victory. Marcus popped the heavy cork and poured the bubbling golden liquid into the glasses. He handed one directly to me, his dark eyes shining with profound, absolute pride and deep mutual respect. He raised his glass slightly, looking around the sprawling, beautiful office, and then looking directly back at me. He told me that we had completely burned the toxic, infected forest straight down to the absolute ground, and we had successfully grown a massive, unbreakable redwood in its exact place. We gently clinked our crystal glasses together, the crisp, clear sound echoing beautifully across the quiet executive office. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the cold champagne, feeling the bright, effervescent bubbles completely wash away the last lingering microscopic traces of the horrific nightmare we had barely survived. I looked at Marcus, the man who had lost his own wife to the exact same massive toxic delusion that had almost completely destroyed my life. We had both been violently targeted by incredibly selfish, manipulative monsters, but we had completely refused to become their permanent, helpless victims. I turned back toward the massive glass window, resting my hand gently against the cool, smooth surface. The afternoon sun was beginning to set over the icy Chicago River, casting long, beautiful golden shadows across the bustling city streets far below. I watched the tiny, distant cars moving rapidly through the intricate urban grid, completely disconnected from the massive, catastrophic war I had just successfully waged and entirely won. For the absolute first time in my entire 32 years of existence, I felt completely, profoundly, and entirely free. The heavy, suffocating chains of toxic family loyalty that had dragged me down my entire life were entirely, permanently shattered. I no longer had to constantly, desperately contort myself into a smaller, quieter version of myself just to make my parents feel comfortable. I no longer had to actively, continuously sacrifice my own hard-earned wealth and my own precious happiness to artificially prop up my deeply incompetent sister. They were entirely gone, locked away in federal prison cells, and cramped, miserable apartments, completely drowning in the severe, catastrophic consequences of their own horrific actions. The thick, toxic bloodline that had actively tried to violently sink me to the bottom of the ocean had instead served as the exact heavy anchor I needed to completely launch myself into the absolute stratosphere. I took another slow, deep breath of the crisp, clean air circulating through my beautiful high-rise office. The empire was officially built, the massive, unyielding fortress was entirely secured, and the absolute brilliant rest of my entirely independent life was officially just beginning. Sometimes the people who share your exact DNA are the very same ones holding the sharpest knife directly to your back. We are taught from a very young age that family is supposed to be our absolute safest harbor in this unpredictable world. We are conditioned to believe that blood is thicker than water, and that we must always relentlessly forgive the people who raised us simply because we share the same last name. But my story completely shatters that dangerous toxic illusion. You should never, under any circumstances, set yourself on fire just to keep your toxic family warm. I spent my entire adult life desperately trying to buy the love and basic respect of people who only ever viewed me as a disposable financial resource and a convenient stepping stone for their own selfish desires. When they pushed me to the absolute brink of total ruin, I finally realized that my loyalty was completely misplaced. True family does not forge your signature on federal documents. True family does not steal your hard-earned life savings to fund a pathetic lie. And true family absolutely does not demand your complete destruction just to save themselves from the consequences of their own horrific actions. Walking away from the people who gave you life is incredibly painful, but sometimes it is the absolute only way to ensure your own survival. It takes immense, profound courage to finally look at your own parents and realize they're incredibly broken, toxic people who will never give you the unconditional love you truly deserve. But the exact moment you completely stop desperately seeking their impossible validation is the exact moment you finally reclaim your own ultimate power. If you have ever had to make the incredibly painful but absolutely necessary decision to cut off toxic family members just to permanently save yourself, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. Your engagement helps these vital stories reach other incredible strong women who might be sitting in the dark right now, desperately needing to hear that they are absolutely not alone in their struggle. I want to build a massive supportive community of resilient survivors right here. Please let me know in the comments below exactly where you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. I read every single comment, and I deeply love connecting with all of you across the entire world. Remember that your personal boundaries are your absolute impenetrable fortress. Never apologize for protecting your own peace, your own hard-earned success, and your own beautiful life. You are entirely worthy of genuine unconditional love and profound respect precisely as you are. Thank you so much for staying with me through this incredible journey. Keep your head held incredibly high and stay strong. I will see you in the next story.